Betrayal has a particular scent, antiseptic and cold, like hospital corridors at 3 a.m. I've become intimately familiar with both. The abandonment during the darkest hours of my life left a wound deeper than any surgeon's scalpel. Yet somehow, it's the audacity of his return that truly steals my breath away. Funny how someone can walk out when you're fighting for your life, then reappear the moment they need something from you. They say sickness reveals true character. If that's the case, then my ex-husband's character is written in disappearing ink. Present when convenient, invisible when needed. Now he wants my signature on insurance papers. As if the wedding vows he shredded while I was hooked to chemotherapy drips somehow left that one obligation intact. In sickness and in health, unless it gets really hard, then all bets are off. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stare at his unread text messages on my phone, each one a digital pebble thrown against the window of my new life. A life I built from the ashes of the one he walked away from. A life that required me to be stronger than I ever thought possible. My oncologist says stress is the enemy of recovery. But some battles you can't help but fight, especially when they arrive uninvited on your doorstep 2 years too late. I wasn't always this person, hardened, cautious, with walls built high, and foundations deep. Before cancer, before betrayal, I was Madeline Cooper, high school English teacher, wife of 12 years to Ethan, and eternal optimist who believed in second chances. Now I'm just Maddie, cancer survivor, divorcee, and woman who learned the hard way that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt once they've burned. My story begins not with diagnosis, but with abandonment. Because that's when my real fight started. Not against the cancer in my body, but against the betrayal that threatened to metastasize in my heart. I remember that day with crystal clarity, April 17th, a Tuesday that felt like any other until it wasn't. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Dr. Winter's office, nature's soft percussion accompanying the bomb that was about to detonate in my life. I sat in one of those uncomfortable vinyl chairs, the kind that stick to your thighs in summer, while Ethan's hand rested limply in mine. Stage 3 breast cancer, Dr. Winters said, her voice gentle but direct. We need to start treatment immediately. The words hung in the air between us, dense and suffocating. I squeezed Ethan's hand, seeking anchorage in the sudden storm, but his fingers remained limp, unresponsive. When I looked at him, his face had transformed into something unrecognizable, distant, almost vacant. In that moment, while I was absorbing the news that would reshape my entire existence, my husband of 12 years was already mentally packing his bags. We'll fight this together, I said, the words emerging automatically, a reflex of hope I still possessed. Right, Ethan? He nodded, but his eyes never met mine. Instead, they remained fixed on the framed medical degrees on Dr. Winter's wall, as if seeking escape in their academic formality. The drive home passed in a silence so complete, I could hear the windshield wipers keeping time with my racing heart. Ethan gripped the steering wheel like it might try to escape, his knuckles white with tension. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the growing chasm between us, but something held me back, an instinctive recognition that he had already begun withdrawing to a place I couldn't follow. At home, Ethan moved mechanically through our routines, making dinner that neither of us ate, loading the dishwasher with precision that felt like avoidance. We sat on opposite ends of our gray sectional sofa, the one we'd spent weekends debating in furniture stores, the one where we'd cuddled through countless movie nights, now a measured expanse of fabric and emotional distance between us. We should make a plan, I said, breaking the silence that had stretched from the doctor's office to our living room. For treatment, for work, for everything. Ethan nodded, still not meeting my eyes. Yeah, we should. But "we" was already becoming a fiction, dissolving like sugar in hot tea, leaving behind only the bitter aftertaste of what once was. The following weeks blurred into a kaleidoscope of appointments, blood draws, and consultations. I created spreadsheets, researched treatment options, joined support groups, fighting not just the cancer, but the creeping sense of isolation as Ethan retreated further into himself. He attended the first 2 appointments, sitting stiffly in corner chairs, checking his phone with increasing frequency before the excuses began. The Henderson account needs immediate attention. The quarterly report deadline got moved up. Brad needs backup on the Seattle presentation. Each excuse more plausible than the last, each one driving the wedge deeper between us. My best friend, Valerie, started driving me to appointments, her fierce loyalty a stark contrast to my husband's growing absence. "He's just processing," I defended him to Valerie as she helped me into her car for my 3rd chemotherapy session. "Some people need space to handle difficult situations." Valerie's silence spoke volumes, but I clung to my rationalization like a life raft. After all, cancer was happening to both of us, wasn't it? Changing both our lives forever? I extended to Ethan the grace I desperately needed myself, even as I spent nights vomiting alone, even as I recorded television shows he was missing, even as I left detailed notes about medication schedules he never acknowledged. The physical toll of chemotherapy was expected. The hair loss, the nausea, the bone-deep fatigue that made even lifting a book an exercise in determination. What I hadn't anticipated was the emotional isolation, the way Ethan would come home later each night, the growing stack of untouched dinner plates I'd leave covered in the refrigerator, the way he began sleeping in the guest room so he wouldn't disturb me. 6 weeks into treatment, I woke at midnight to the sound of drawers opening and closing. Wrapping my robe around my increasingly frail body, I followed the noise to our walk-in closet, where Ethan stood surrounded by half-empty shelves and a large suitcase. "What are you doing?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin and tremulous. Ethan flinched as if I'd struck him, his hand frozen in the act of folding a blue button-down shirt, the one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. He didn't turn around immediately, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath before he faced me. "I can't do this, Maddie." 5 words that demolished the foundation of our shared life. "Can't do what?" I asked, though I already knew. The answer, could see it written in the suitcase, in the empty spaces on his side of the closet, in the deliberate way he avoided looking at my thinning hair and hollowed cheeks. Any of it. The sickness, the hospitals, the constant worry. I'm not built for this." He folded the shirt with methodical precision, placing it in the suitcase alongside what looked like a week's worth of clothing. "I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I'm drowning here." "You're drowning." The words escaped on a laugh that contained no humor. "I'm the one fighting for my life. And I'm failing you." He zipped the suitcase with finality. "I can't be what you need right now. I'm not strong enough." "So your solution is to leave? When things get hard, you just quit?" Ethan finally looked at me then, his face a battlefield of guilt and relief. "I've taken a temporary assignment in Chicago. The company needs someone to oversee the merger, and I need some space to think." Space. I echoed the word, testing its weight, its implications. "While I'm going through chemotherapy, while I'm losing my hair, my energy, possibly my life. It's not forever," he said, but we both heard the lie in his words. "Just until things stabilize. Until I'm either better or dead." The bluntness of my question made him flinch again. "Which would be more convenient for you, Ethan?" He had no answer for that, just the continued avoidance of his gaze and the tightening of his grip on the suitcase handle. "What about my treatments? What about the medical bills? What about the promise you made 12 years ago?" Each question hit like a physical blow, but Ethan had already erected his shields, retreating behind the wall of his decision. I'll continue. To handle the finances, he said, as if offering a generous concession. My insurance will cover your treatments. I've set up automatic payments for the household bills. So you'll support me financially while abandoning me emotionally? The room spun slightly. The combination of late-night confrontation and chemotherapy, weakness making me reach for the doorframe to steady myself. How magnanimous of you. Ethan moved toward the bedroom door, suitcase in hand, pausing when he drew level with me. For a moment, I thought he might embrace me, might come to his senses and unpack his bags, might choose us over fear. Instead, he placed a light kiss on my forehead, a gesture so detached it might as well have been a business handshake. I'm sorry, Maddie. I never thought I'd be this person. His voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd heard from him in weeks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Neither did I whispered, too exhausted to scream, too devastated to beg him to stay. Neither did I. The front door closed with a soft click that belied the seismic shift it represented. I stood in our half-empty closet, surrounded by the spaces where his life had been subtracted from mine, and felt a curious sense of clarity descend. If Ethan could walk away when I needed him most, then he had never been who I thought he was. And if that was true, then perhaps losing him wasn't the tragedy it seemed. I crawled back into our bed, now just my bed, and stared at the ceiling until dawn painted it gold. The house felt different without him, quieter, but somehow less suffocating. As the morning light strengthened, I made a decision that would carry me through the darkest days ahead. If Ethan could abandon our vows when they became inconvenient, I could abandon the idea that I needed him to survive. Little did I know that this night, this wrenching separation, was just the beginning of a story that would eventually circle back to me in ways I could never have anticipated. The signature he would one day desperately need was already in my hand, invisible but gaining strength with each beat of my wounded but resilient heart. Morning arrived with cruel brightness the day after Ethan left. Sunlight streamed through curtains we had chosen together, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air of our half-empty home. The house felt both too large and too small simultaneously, echoing with absence yet suffocating with memories. I lay in bed, my body a battlefield of chemical warfare and emotional devastation, wondering which would claim victory first. The bedside clock showed 9:37 a.m., time for my anti-nausea medication. With effort that felt monumental, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, steadying myself against the wave of dizziness that followed. The bottle sat on my nightstand where I'd placed it the night before, next to a glass of water that had gone warm overnight. Such simple tasks, taking pills, drinking water, now required planning, strategy, and reserves of strength I wasn't sure I possessed. The house phone rang as I swallowed the medication, the sound jarring in the morning quiet. Valerie's voice came through the answering machine, concern evident in every syllable. Maddie, it's me. Just checking in. You have your big appointment today, and I'm picking you up at 11. Call me when you're up. The appointment, of course. Today was my consultation with Dr. Winters about the next phase of treatment. I'd marked it on our shared calendar in red, circled it twice, even mentioned it to Ethan last week during one of his brief appearances at home. He had nodded distractedly, eyes never leaving his laptop screen. Now I would face it alone. Or not entirely alone, Valerie would be there, as she had been increasingly over the past weeks. But the empty space where a husband should stand felt like a physical presence, a ghost of support that haunted every medical discussion. I shuffled to the shower, avoiding my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I'd become skilled at this particular dance, angling my head just so, focusing on tasks rather than the stranger my body had become. The warm water provided momentary relief, washing away the night sweat that had become my constant companion, though nothing could cleanse the sense of abandonment that clung to me like a second skin. Valerie arrived promptly at 11, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago. For emergencies. The sound of her bustling energy filled the hollow spaces of the house. "Maddie? You decent? I brought bagels from Rosenberg's, the good ones with everything seasoning." Her voice carried up the stairs, a lifeline of normalcy in my shipwrecked existence. "In the bedroom," I called back, my voice stronger than I expected. "Just finishing up." I secured my headscarf, a beautiful silk one in shades of blue that Valerie had given me when my hair began falling out in clumps, and took one final inventory of my appearance. The woman in the mirror was thinner, paler, with shadows, beneath her eyes that spoke of battles fought in darkness. But she was standing. She was dressed. She was continuing. These had become my metrics for success. Valerie appeared in the doorway, a paper bag in one hand and 2 coffee cups in the other. Her eyes swept over me, taking in details I couldn't hide from my best friend of 20 years. "You look good," she lied kindly, setting the breakfast, items on my dresser. "That scarf brings out your eyes." "Liar," I said, but smiled despite myself. "But thank you for pretending." Valerie's expression shifted, concern breaking through her cheerful facade. "Have you heard from him?" No need to specify who him was. Ethan had been relegated to pronoun status in our conversations, as if speaking his name might conjure him like a demon in a folktale. He texted that he arrived in Chicago. That's it. I adjusted my scarf, focusing on the material between my fingers rather than the hurt that bloomed fresh with the admission. "Apparently, the Chicago office has quite the view of Lake Michigan." "What an absolute don't," I interrupted, not ready for the colorful description I knew Valerie was about to unleash. "Let's not waste energy on him today. I need everything I've got for this appointment." Valerie pressed her lips together, visibly swallowing her anger. "You're right. Bagel first, then cancer-kicking consultation." She handed me one of the coffee cups. "Decaf, vanilla latte with almond milk. Doctor approved." The drive to the oncology center passed with Valerie filling the space with chatter about her job at the library, her latest disastrous Tinder date, and neighborhood gossip, all carefully curated topics that required no emotional heavy lifting from me. I was grateful for her effort, for the pretense of normalcy she maintained even as she navigated hospital parking with practiced ease, for the way she matched her pace to my slowed steps without comment. Dr. Winter's office hadn't changed in the 6 weeks since Ethan and I had sat there together, receiving the news that would fracture our lives. The same educational posters adorned the walls. The same box of tissues sat strategically placed on her desk. The same gentle-voiced nurse took my vitals before ushering us in. What had changed was the empty chair beside me, now occupied by Valerie instead of my husband. "Madeline," Dr. Winters greeted me with a warm handshake, her eyes taking in the vacancy where Ethan should have been. "How are you feeling today? Physically or emotionally?" The question slipped out before I could filter it, surprising both of us with its directness. Dr. Winters's smile was understanding. "Both are equally important to your treatment. Physically, the nausea is better with the new medication. The fatigue is substantial. Emotionally." I glanced at Valerie, drawing strength from her encouraging nod. "My husband left yesterday. He's taken a position in Chicago." To her credit, Dr. Winters didn't offer platitudes or empty sympathies. Instead, she made a note in my file, her expression neutral, but her eyes compassionate. "I'm sorry to hear that. Changes in support systems can impact treatment experiences significantly. We should discuss adjusting your care plan accordingly." She turned to Valerie. "Are you a family member?" "Best friend," Valerie answered firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Winters nodded. "Good. Support is crucial. Now, let's talk about your blood work from Monday." The consultation continued, a clinical discussion of white blood cell counts, tumor responses, and medication adjustments. I took notes mechanically, part of me floating above the scene, observing this strange new reality where I navigated life-altering medical decisions without the person who had promised to stand by me through everything. When Dr. Winters mentioned surgery, a lumpectomy followed by radiation, as the next step after my final 2 chemotherapy sessions, the reality of my situation crashed back through my detachment. Surgery is scheduled for July 8th, Dr. Winters said, checking her calendar. You'll need someone to stay with you for at least the first 48 hours afterward. I'll be there, Valerie immediately volunteered, reaching over to squeeze my hand. And we'll need to update your emergency contact information, the doctor continued, sliding a form across her desk. Currently, we have Ethan Cooper listed. The simple administrative task felt like another abandonment. Erasing Ethan's name, writing Valerie's instead, each pen stroke a formal acknowledgement that the person who should have been my first call in an emergency had voluntarily removed himself from that position. As we left the oncology center, armed with new prescriptions and appointment cards, the reality of my situation settled fully on my shoulders. I was facing cancer surgery as a suddenly single woman, navigating medical decisions alone that we should have tackled together. The unfairness of it burned in my chest, sharper than any physical pain I'd experienced. He doesn't get to do this, I said suddenly as Valerie drove us home, breaking the thoughtful silence that had fallen between us. He doesn't get to just walk away like our marriage meant nothing. Valerie glanced at me, surprise evident in her expression. It was the first spark of fight I'd shown since Ethan's departure. No, he doesn't, she agreed carefully. What are you thinking? I stared out the window at the passing landscape, at people going about their normal lives, walking dogs, carrying groceries, holding hands, all blissfully unaware that my world had collapsed. I'm thinking I need a lawyer, I said finally. Not because I want anything from him, but because I need to protect myself. Valerie nodded slowly. My cousin Diane is a family law attorney. I can give her a call if you want. Please. The single word contained multitudes. Acknowledgement of my new reality. Acceptance of help. A step toward a future I hadn't planned for, but now had to face. That evening, after Valerie had reluctantly left, only after stocking my refrigerator, and setting up a medication schedule on my phone, I sat at our dining room table with a legal pad and began making lists. Practical matters that needed addressing. Health insurance, currently through Ethan's employer, household bills, upcoming medical expenses, updating my will. The mundane administrative details of unraveling a life built for two. My phone chimed with a text message. Ethan's name appeared on the screen, sending an unwelcome surge of adrenaline through my system. Checking in. How did the appointment go? The casual tone, as if he were on a regular business trip rather than having abandoned our marriage, sparked something molten in my chest. My fingers hovered over the screen as I considered my response. Part of me wanted to pour out every detail of the day. The fear I'd felt hearing about surgery, the humiliation of changing emergency contacts, the physical toll of simply making it through the appointment. Another part wanted to tell him exactly where he could put his belated concern. Instead, I set the phone down without responding. His question didn't deserve an answer. His comfort didn't deserve consideration. The man who couldn't face cancer with me didn't deserve updates on my fight against it. That night, I moved my belongings out of our master bedroom and into the guest room, the same one Ethan had retreated to in his final weeks at home. The bed was smaller, the space more confined, but it held no memories of late-night conversations or Sunday morning coffee or the countless intimate moments that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. In this neutral territory, I could begin again, patient zero in the epidemic of my new existence. As I drifted toward sleep, my body heavy with medication and fatigue, a strange sense of clarity emerged through the fog of betrayal and illness. Ethan had made his choice. Now I would make mine. To survive, not just the cancer, but the abandonment. To rebuild, not just my health, but my independence. To discover who Madeline Cooper might be when she was neither wife nor patient, but simply herself. Little did I know that this resolution, formed in the quiet darkness of a spare bedroom, would be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The strength I was finding would soon face its greatest challenge, not from disease, but from the unexpected return of the man who had walked away when I needed him most. Summer arrived with vengeful heat that year, as if the universe had decided I hadn't faced enough challenges. My body, already at war with itself, now battled the oppressive temperature that turned my small yard into a shimmering mirage and made my wig, a recent purchase for professional appearances, feel like a wool hat in a sauna. The final rounds of chemotherapy proved more brutal than the earlier sessions. My body, already weakened from months of treatment, surrendered what little reserves it had maintained. I measured my days not in hours, but in small victories. Keeping down a piece of toast, walking to the mailbox and back, staying awake through an entire episode of the mindless cooking shows that had become my constant companions. Diane, Valerie's cousin and now my divorce attorney, had filed the initial paperwork 3 weeks after Ethan's departure. No need to wait, she'd advised during our first consultation, her efficient manner a balm to my frayed nerves. His absence during your illness will work in your favor should this become contentious. Ethan's response to the divorce papers came not in legal form, but as a terse email, the corporate tone at odds with the 12 years of history between us. Madeline, I received the divorce filing. I understand your position and won't contest anything. My attorney will work with Diane on the details. I hope this can remain amicable. If you need anything for medical expenses beyond what insurance covers, please let me know. I want to ensure your treatment isn't compromised by our personal situation. Ethan. No apology. No acknowledgement of the magnitude of his betrayal. Just clinical language and financial considerations, as if our marriage had been merely a business arrangement that had reached its natural conclusion. I read the email exactly once before filing it away in a folder labeled Divorce, another piece of evidence in the case I was building against allowing myself to trust so completely again. The practical realities of separation during illness created a bizarre administrative nightmare. Health insurance forms required updating, bank accounts needed separating, utility bills demanded transferring. All tasks that drained precious energy I needed for healing. Each phone call began with the same exhausting explanation. Yes, I'm still on my husband's insurance. No, he doesn't live here anymore. Yes, I'm authorized to discuss the account. On particularly difficult days, when the nausea rendered me incapable of leaving the bathroom floor, I allowed myself brief moments of rage at the unfairness of it all. Not just at the cancer, that was a biological betrayal beyond anyone's control, but at Ethan's voluntary abandonment. His conscious choice to leave when staying became inconvenient. He took the easy way out, I told Dr. Winters during one of our regular check-ins, my voice flat with a fatigue that went beyond physical. He couldn't handle the sickness part of in sickness and in health. What does that say about the person I chose to marry? Dr. Winters, who had become as much therapist as oncologist during our sessions, considered her response carefully. It says more about him than about your judgment, Madeline. Some people simply cannot face mortality this directly. It triggers their own deepest fears. So I should forgive him because he was scared? The bitterness in my laugh surprised. Even me. I was terrified too. I still am. But I don't have the luxury of walking away from this body. Forgiveness isn't about excusing his actions, she replied, making another note in my ever-growing file. It's about freeing yourself from carrying the weight of his failure alongside everything else you're bearing. Her words lingered long, after our appointment, following me home like a stray thought seeking adoption. Forgiveness seemed an impossible destination from where I stood, but perhaps she was right about setting down the burden of Ethan's betrayal. I had enough to carry, already. The day of my surgery arrived with merciful coolness, a rare break in the summer heat wave. Valerie had stayed the night before, sleeping on the sofa, despite my protests that the guest room bed was available. "I've seen that mattress," she'd quipped while arranging her makeshift bed. "My back would never forgive me." The truth, which neither of us acknowledged, was that she wanted to be within earshot should I need anything during the night. Such was the nature of our friendship now. Practical considerations masked as casual choices, deep concern disguised as offhand remarks. The hospital routine had become familiar. The same check-in desk, the same paperwork, the same antiseptic smell that never quite left my nostrils these days. But this time carried different weight. Surgery represented both threat and promise. I'm the physical cutting away of disease, the pain of recovery, and the hope of emerging on the other side with fewer cancer cells than I'd arrived with. As the nurse walked through pre-surgery preparations, a subtle shift in her expression caught my attention. She glanced at the door, then back at my chart, her professional smile faltering momentarily. Following her gaze, I turned to see what had caused her reaction. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking both out of place and unnervingly familiar. 3 months of absence hadn't changed him outwardly. The same sandy hair, the same wire-rimmed glasses, the same slightly rumpled business, casual attire, but something in his posture spoke of discomfort, of someone who knew they had surrendered the right to occupy the space they now inhabited. "Maddie," he said, my nickname in his mouth an unwelcome intimacy. Valerie told me about the surgery. I thought I should be here." The room suddenly felt airless, my carefully constructed world of independence threatening to collapse under the weight of his unexpected presence. Valerie appeared behind him, her expression a battlefield of apology and defiance. "He called the house," she explained, moving to my side as if to physically demonstrate her allegiance. "He kept asking, and I thought you should have the choice of whether to see him or not." Choice. Such a simple word for such a complex concept. Did I want to see the man who had abandoned me when I needed him most? Did I want his presence during one of the most vulnerable moments of my treatment journey? Did I want to give him the opportunity to ease his guilt by playing the supportive spouse for one carefully timed appearance? No. The word emerged with surprising steadiness, a complete sentence containing months of hurt and resolution. "No, I don't want you here, Ethan." His face registered genuine shock, as if the possibility of rejection had never occurred to him. "Maddie, I know I made a mistake. I just want to support me now that the hard part is almost over." The IV in my arm restricted movement, but my voice carried all the strength my body lacked. "You don't get to dip in and out of this like it's a pool party. Cancer isn't a spectator sport where you can show up for the final quarter and claim to be a fan." "That's not what I'm doing," he protested, taking a step into the room despite my clear dismissal. "I've had time to think, to realize what's important." "Time," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "I've had time too, Ethan. Time in waiting rooms wondering where my husband was. Time throwing up alone at 3 a.m. Time rearranging. My entire life because you decided our vows had an escape clause." The pre-surgery medication was beginning to take effect, softening the edges of my anger, but my resolve remained intact. I turned to the nurse, who had been pretending to review my chart during this exchange. "I don't want him here," I said clearly. "He's not authorized to receive any information about my condition or treatment." The nurse nodded, professionalism masking whatever personal opinions she might have formed during our exchange. "I'll make a note in your file and alert the surgical team." She turned to Ethan with polite firmness. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to return to the waiting area." "And this isn't over, Maddie," Ethan said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone he'd once used to make promises neither of us had imagined would be broken. "We need to talk when you're feeling better." "We're already talking," I replied, the medication making my words slightly slurred but no less determined. "Through lawyers. That seems fitting for what we've become to each other." Valerie moved between us, a physical barrier against further emotional intrusion. "You should go, Ethan. This isn't helping Maddie, and right now she's the only one who matters." After he left, escorted by the nurse who returned moments later, Valerie took my hand. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I thought." "It's okay," I assured her, the room beginning to tilt pleasantly as the pre-surgical medication took stronger hold. "You gave me a choice. He never did." As they wheeled me toward the operating room, bright lights passing overhead like strange stars, I found myself thinking not of Ethan's unexpected appearance, but of Dr. Winter's words about forgiveness. Perhaps this confrontation was the first step, not in excusing what he'd done, but in acknowledging that his actions belonged to him alone. My recovery, both from surgery and from betrayal, would be my own journey to navigate. The anesthesiologist asked me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7 before darkness welcomed me into temporary oblivion, a brief respite from both physical pain and emotional wounds. My last coherent thought was strangely peaceful. Whatever I found on the other side of consciousness would be faced on my terms, not Ethan's. The recovery room came into focus gradually, like a photograph developing. First outlines, then details, then the complete picture of a standard hospital room. Beeping monitors, muted colors, the unmistakable scent of institutional cleaning products. Valerie sat beside my bed, reading glasses perched on her nose, as she thumbed through a worn paperback. "No boat on the lake today?" I murmured, my throat raw from the intubation tube. Valerie's head snapped up, relief washing over her features. "Look who's rejoined the land of the living." She sat down, her book reaching for the water cup with its bendy straw. Small sips, doctor's orders. The cool water felt like salvation on my parched throat. As awareness returned more fully, so did the pain. A sharp, insistent presence beneath the dulling blanket of medication. I raised a hand to my chest, feeling the thick bandaging beneath the hospital gown. "Everything went well," Valerie said, answering my unspoken question. "Dr. Carter came out about an hour ago. They got clean margins, which she seemed very happy about." Clean margins. 2 simple words that contained universes of hope. The surgeon had removed the tumor and enough surrounding tissue to believe they'd captured all the cancer cells in that area. It wasn't the end of the journey. Radiation would follow, but it was a significant milestone. "And our unexpected visitor?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Didn't want to allow Ethan's presence to intrude on this moment of medical victory. "Gone," Valerie confirmed. "He waited about an hour, then left when no one would tell him anything. About your condition." A small, satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Hospital staff takes patient confidentiality very seriously." I nodded, relief mixing with an emotion I wasn't ready to name. Despite everything, some small, traitorous part of me had wondered if he would stay. If his appearance might signal the beginning of atonement, rather than a momentary salve for his conscience. "Your phone's been blowing up, by the way," Valerie added, nodding toward the plastic hospital bag containing my personal items. "It's mostly the group text with the other English teachers sending good vibes, but there are a couple from him, too. I didn't read them." "Thank you." Whether I was thanking her for the message delivery or her discretion, I wasn't entirely sure. Later that night, after Valerie had been shooed home with assurances that hospital staff would monitor me overnight, I finally reached for my phone. The screen illuminated the dimmed room as I scrolled through messages of support from colleagues, a few former students who'd heard about my condition, and my elderly neighbor who had been collecting my mail. Ethan's messages sat like landmines among the well wishes. I hope the surgery went well. Thinking of you. And later, I understand why you didn't want me there. I just want you to know I'm sorry for everything. Sorry. Such an inadequate word for the magnitude of his actions. What exactly was he sorry for? Leaving during my greatest need? Showing up unannounced at the hospital? The fact that I'd called him on his transparent attempt to ease his guilt? I set the phone aside without responding, turning instead to the window where Chicago's night skyline sparkled like a false promise. The physical pain of surgery seemed appropriate somehow, a tangible manifestation of the invisible wounds I'd been carrying since Ethan's departure. But unlike emotional injuries, this physical pain would diminish with time and medication. The surgeon had cut away diseased tissue, creating space for healing. Perhaps, I thought as morphine drew me back toward sleep, I needed to perform a similar surgery on my heart, excising the diseased parts of my marriage from the healthy tissue of my self-worth, creating clean margins between who we had been together and who I would become alone. What I didn't realize then, drifting on a cloud of post-surgical medication, was that Ethan's reappearance at the hospital was merely the opening salvo in a campaign I hadn't anticipated. The real battle for my signature, and for the final, word in our unraveling relationship, was yet to begin. Autumn painted the world in rust and gold outside my living room window as I lay on the sofa, wrapped in the quilt my grandmother had made for my 16th birthday. 3 months had passed. Since the surgery, then 6 weeks of radiation that left my skin burned and tender, like a cruel sunburn that penetrated to the bone. The treatment had concluded 2 weeks ago, leaving me in that strange liminal space between active fighting and cautious hope. No longer a full-time patient, not yet a survivor. The medical port that had been my constant companion, the access point for chemicals both poisonous and healing, had been removed the previous week. Its absence left a small, puckered scar below my collarbone, one of many markings cancer had etched onto my body. These scars mapped a journey I hadn't chosen, but had somehow survived. Coordinates of pain and perseverance written in my flesh. Recovery had become my full-time occupation. Each day followed a careful routine designed to rebuild strength without overtaxing my depleted reserves. Morning gentle yoga, approved by my medical team. Afternoon short walks, extending a little, further each day. Evening meditation to quiet the anxieties that still circled like vultures whenever my guard dropped. Between these anchors of activity, I napped without shame, my body demanding rest with an authority I no longer questioned. The high school where I taught had arranged a long-term substitute for the entire fall semester. My department head, Dorothy, visited weekly, bringing faculty gossip and student messages that connected me to the world I hoped to rejoin. "Take all the time you need," she insisted during each visit. "Your job is waiting whenever you're ready." The security of that knowledge was a luxury I didn't take for granted, especially as medical bills continued to arrive with alarming regularity despite insurance coverage. My divorce from Ethan progressed with the same methodical pace as my physical recovery. Diane had negotiated the separation of our modest assets with clinical efficiency. The house would remain mine. I had made the down payment with inheritance, money from my grandmother. My retirement fund would stay intact. Ethan would keep his 401k and the bulk of our joint savings, an arrangement that felt fair given the circumstances. All that remained was the signing of final papers and the court date that would legally end our 12 years of marriage. "This is as clean a break as I've ever managed for a client," Diane told me during our last in-person meeting, her satisfaction evident as she reviewed the settlement details, especially considering the circumstances. The circumstances. Such a polite term for abandonment during life-threatening illness. But I had come to appreciate Diane's professional detachment, her ability to translate emotional devastation into actionable legal terms. She dealt in facts, not feelings. A approach I was trying to adopt myself. October had just begun when the first letter arrived. Not an email or text, but an actual envelope with a Chicago postmark and Ethan's distinctive handwriting. It sat on my entry table for 3 days before I found the emotional energy to open it. Inside was a single sheet of his company letterhead, the corporate logo and incongruous frame for the personal message. Maddie, I know I have no right to contact you directly, but there are things I need to say that shouldn't go through lawyers. I've spent months thinking about my actions and trying to understand why I failed so completely as a husband when you needed me most. There's no excuse for what I did. Fear overwhelmed me, not just of losing you, but of being helpless to prevent it. I couldn't bear to watch you suffer, knowing I couldn't fix it. Instead of supporting you through that fear, I ran from it and betrayed everything we built together. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I recognize the magnitude of my failure. The divorce papers will be signed as soon as they reach me. If you ever need anything at all, I'm here. Ethan. I read the letter twice before setting it aside, searching for the emotional response I expected: anger, vindication, even satisfaction at his admission of failure. Instead, I felt a curious emptiness, as if the words had arrived too late to matter, addressed to a version of myself that no longer existed. The Madeline Cooper who had loved Ethan completely, who had built her life around their partnership, might have treasured this acknowledgement. But that woman had been transformed by illness, by abandonment, by the daily act of continuing without him. The person I had become regarded his belated insights with something approaching indifference. I placed the letter in the same folder as his emails, another artifact from a relationship becoming increasingly distant in my rearview mirror. Life continued its careful forward motion. Medical follow-ups, tentative plans to return to teaching part-time in the spring, evening phone calls with Valerie that no longer centered exclusively on cancer or divorce, but had expanded to include books, politics, and her latest dating misadventures. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, thicker than the first. This time I opened it immediately, clinical curiosity replacing emotional hesitation. Inside was a packet of insurance documents from Ethan's employer, accompanied by another handwritten note: Maddie, the company is changing insurance providers effective January 1st. I've arranged to keep you on my policy through the transition to ensure continuity of care with your current doctors. The HR department needs the attached forms completed to process this extension. I know our divorce will be finalized before then, but I've received special approval to maintain your coverage for an additional 6 months post-divorce given your medical situation. Please review and sign where indicated, then return in the enclosed envelope by November 15th. I hope your recovery is progressing well. Ethan. The practical considerations of his offer collided with my emotional response. Continued insurance coverage through his employer would indeed simplify my life considerably. No disruption in care, no need to find new doctors who accepted different plans, no gap in coverage during a critical phase of my recovery. From a purely logical standpoint, his offer made sense. Yet something about it scraped against my newly formed boundaries like fingernails on slate. This arrangement would maintain a connection, a dependency, when I had worked so hard to disentangle our lives. It felt like a noose of obligation, however well-intentioned, at a time when I was finally breathing freely. I set the papers aside, without signing them, promising myself I would discuss the matter with both Diane and Dr. Winters before making a decision. My independence, so recently and painfully acquired, felt too precious to compromise without careful consideration. The third communication from Ethan came not in written form, but as an unexpected package delivered by courier the following week. The sleek black box bore no identifying marks beyond my address, intriguing me enough to open it immediately. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay a slim silver bracelet with a simple medical alert tag. Engraved on its surface were my essential medical details: blood type, cancer medication, emergency contact information listing Valerie's number. A small card accompanied it. Saw this and thought of your safety. No strings attached. E. The thoughtfulness of the gift caught me off guard. It was exactly the kind of practical item I had been meaning to purchase for myself. Not decorative, but potentially life-saving, especially as I began venturing out alone more frequently. The fact that he had listed Valerie as the emergency contact rather than himself spoke to an understanding of our new reality that his previous communications had lacked. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist, its weight unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. As my finger traced the engraved medical information, I found myself wondering what might be prompting this sudden campaign of consideration from the man who had walked away during my darkest hours. Was it genuine remorse? Lingering guilt? Or something else entirely? My questions found partial answers the following day when Dorothy arrived for her weekly visit, bearing not only faculty gossip but unexpected information. I ran into Paul Wilson at the grocery store, she mentioned casually as she arranged the flowers she'd brought on my coffee table. Paul had been Ethan's closest friend since college, the best man at our wedding, though our contact had predictably dwindled after Ethan's departure. "How is he?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. Dorothy hesitated, adjusting a lily with unnecessary precision. "He mentioned that Ethan's been having some health issues of his own. Nothing life-threatening," she added quickly, seeing my expression. "Apparently some kind of autoimmune condition they're still in the process of diagnosing. He's been going through a lot of tests." The information settled like a stone in still water, sending ripples through my carefully constructed detachment. Ethan, facing his own health crisis after fleeing from mine. The irony wasn't lost on me, nor was the complexity of emotions it triggered: concern I didn't want to feel, a flash of vindication I wasn't proud of, and underneath it all, a nagging suspicion about the timing of his recent overtures. "That's why he's back in town so often lately," Dorothy continued, apparently unaware of the impact of her casual revelation. "Paul said he's been seeing specialists at University Hospital." University Hospital, the same medical center where I'd received my treatment, where Ethan had made his unwelcome appearance before my surgery. The coincidence seemed too neat, raising questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. After Dorothy left, I retrieved the insurance documents from my desk drawer, examining them with new eyes. The language about continuity of care took on different meaning when considered alongside Ethan's own developing medical situation. Was the extension of coverage as much for his benefit as mine? Did his condition somehow make maintaining me on his policy advantageous? I reached for my phone, composing a text message before I could overthink it. "Heard you've been dealing with some health issues. Hope you're getting answers and good care." His response came within minutes, confirming my suspicions about the frequency with which he checked for communication from me. News travels fast in small circles. "Yes, some autoimmune complications they're still identifying. Nothing compared to what you faced." I stared at his response, reading between the lines. His acknowledgement of my greater struggle felt genuine, but left my central question unanswered. I decided on directness. "Does your current health situation have anything to do with the insurance extension you've offered?" This time, the response took longer, the typing indicator appearing and disappearing several times before his message arrived. "Partly. The new insurance plan has better coverage for autoimmune specialists, which would benefit both of us. But I would have arranged for your extended coverage regardless. Partial honesty, then. Not a complete deception, but not the full transparency I now required in my life." I set the phone down without responding, my decision about the insurance forms crystallizing with newfound clarity. That evening I called Diane, outlining the situation and my concerns. Her pragmatic advice came without hesitation. "Take the coverage extension. It's to your advantage medically. But we'll add a clause to the divorce agreement specifying that this arrangement creates no ongoing legal or personal obligation beyond the 6-month period. This protects you from any implied dependency." "And if there's some angle he's working that we haven't identified?" I asked, voicing the lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. "That's why you have me," Diane replied, her confidence reassuring. "Any request beyond insurance coverage gets funneled directly through this office. No direct negotiations, no emotional leverage." With those boundaries established, I signed the insurance forms the next morning, adding a brief note. "Forms signed. As requested, Diane will be adding clarifying language to the divorce agreement regarding this temporary arrangement. Please direct any further requests through her office. I hope you find answers for your health concerns. Madeline." The formal use of my full name was deliberate, a small but significant indicator of the distance I intended to maintain. As I sealed the envelope, I felt neither victory nor defeat, but something more valuable: clarity. I could accept practical assistance without forfeiting the independence I'd fought so hard to establish. I could acknowledge Ethan's current struggles without erasing his past failures. Most importantly, I could navigate this unexpected development on my own terms, not his. What I couldn't yet see was how this measured response to his insurance request would set the stage for a much larger confrontation, one that would demand not just my signature, but a final reckoning with the man who had walked away when the vows became inconvenient, only to return when he needed something only I could provide. Winter descended on the city with uncharacteristic gentleness that year, as if the universe had finally decided I'd endured enough harshness. Soft snow replaced the usual biting winds, and even the shortest days held a crystalline beauty that made my cautious ventures outdoors feel like small victories. By December, I had progressed from short neighborhood walks to longer excursions: the grocery store without assistance, coffee with Dorothy at the cafe near school, even a Sunday matinee with Valerie where we sat in the back row in case I needed to leave early. My body was healing, gradually reclaiming territory from illness and treatment. The fatigue remained, a stubborn shadow that fell across my afternoons, but its dominion had shrunk from all-consuming to merely inconvenient. My hair had begun to return, a soft down covering my scalp that Valerie insisted was the perfect texture. For the pixie cut I'd never had the courage to try before. Even my appetite had awakened from its long hibernation, prompting experimental cooking sessions that sometimes ended in triumph, sometimes in laughing surrender to takeout. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for January 15th, a date I'd circled on my new calendar with emotions too complex to name. Not celebration exactly, nor mourning, something more nuanced, a formal acknowledgement of an ending that had occurred months earlier in everything but legal documentation. Ethan's medical situation had progressed in parallel to my recovery, information arriving through the filter of mutual acquaintances rather than direct communication. Following my response to the insurance forms, he had respected my boundary of legal intermediaries, channeling all divorce-related communications through Diane. But the small-town grapevine ensured I wasn't completely in the dark about his condition. "Diagnosed with lupus," Paul's wife mentioned when we crossed paths at the pharmacy, her tone carefully neutral as if unsure whether I'd want this information. "He's started treatment, but apparently it's quite aggressive." Later that week, my former neighbor let slip that Ethan had been staying at his brother's place during his treatments, not commuting from Chicago as I'd assumed. "Been here nearly a month already," she noted while collecting her mail. "Don't think that Chicago position worked out the way he hoped." These fragments created an incomplete mosaic of Ethan's life: medical struggles, career complications, temporary housing. Under different circumstances, I would have known every detail, would have been the one organizing his medication schedule and researching his condition late into the night. The realization that I now occupied the outer circles of his life, receiving information third-hand like a distant acquaintance, carried a strange poignancy I hadn't anticipated. Christmas arrived with quiet celebration. I had declined Valerie's invitation to join her boisterous family gathering, not yet ready for that level of social energy. Instead, a smaller group assembled at my house, Dorothy and her husband, my elderly neighbor Harold, and Valerie, who arrived early to help prepare a simplified feast that honored my still-recovering stamina. As we sat around my dining table, the conversation flowing naturally between serious topics and laughter, I was struck by the realization that this makeshift family had formed in the vacuum left by Ethan's departure. These were the people who had stayed, who had witnessed my struggle without flinching, who had offered help without keeping score. The gratitude I felt toward them was overwhelming, bringing unexpected tears that I quickly blamed on the spiced cider. The holiday card from Ethan arrived the day after Christmas, a simple design featuring a winter landscape rather than the personalized photo cards we'd always sent during our marriage. Inside, beneath the printed greeting, he'd written a brief note, wishing you peace and continued healing in the new year. Thank you for the insurance arrangements. It's helping both of us through difficult times. I placed it on the mantel, alongside cards from colleagues and students, no longer feeling the need to hide or highlight his communication. It was simply one card among many, from one person among many in my expanding post-cancer, post-marriage life. January arrived with a medical milestone, my first quarterly follow-up scan since completing treatment. The anxiety surrounding this appointment had built slowly, a strengthening undercurrent beneath the surface of my daily activities. Each follow-up would carry this weight, I realized. The fear of recurrence never completely absent, merely varying in intensity as time passed. Dr. Winters maintained her characteristic calm as she reviewed the results, her measured tone revealing nothing until she'd completed her assessment. "Everything looks good, Madeline," she finally announced, turning the computer screen so I could see the images. "No evidence of disease. Your blood work shows continued improvement in all markers." The relief was physical, my shoulders dropping from their tensed position near my ears, breath flowing more freely into lungs that had been tight with apprehension. "So, I'm in remission," she confirmed, allowing a rare smile. "Not cured. It's too early for that language, but certainly heading in the right direction." Remission, a beautiful word that tasted of possibility and future tense. I savored it as I left the hospital, texting the good news to my support circle before driving home through streets that suddenly seemed more vibrant, more welcoming. Valerie insisted on a celebration dinner that weekend, reserving a table at an intimate restaurant downtown that I'd mentioned wanting to try when things settled down. Dressed in clothes that finally fit properly again, my body having found a new normal that was neither my pre-cancer self nor my treatment-diminished frame, I felt something approaching normalcy for the first time in over a year. "To remission," Valerie toasted, raising her wine glass as candlelight played across her features. "And to my best friend, the strongest person I know." I clinked my own glass against hers, the sparkling water catching the light as effectively as her wine. "To good friends who make survival possible," I countered, the emotion in my voice unmistakable. Our appetizers had just arrived when I noticed a change in Valerie's expression, her eyes fixed on a point beyond my shoulder, her features tightening subtly. Before I could turn to see what had captured her attention, a familiar voice spoke from just behind me. "Maddie, sorry to interrupt your dinner." Ethan stood beside our table, noticeably thinner than when I'd last seen him at the hospital months earlier. The changes in his appearance were subtle but unmistakable. A slight sallowness to his complexion, a new tightness around his eyes that spoke of chronic pain. He leaned almost imperceptibly on the cane in his right hand, a concession to illness I would never have imagined from the man who once ran half marathons as a casual weekend activity. "Ethan?" My voice remained steady, the shock of his appearance, balanced by months of emotional distance. "I didn't know you frequented this place." "I don't, usually." His gaze flickered to Valerie, acknowledging her with a slight nod before returning to me. "I saw your car in the parking lot and I needed to speak with you." "We're celebrating," Valerie interjected, her protective instincts visible in her posture. Maddie got good news at her follow-up. A genuine smile softened Ethan's features. Momentarily. The scans? I'm really glad to hear it, Maddie. The sincerity in his voice created an uncomfortable ripple in my carefully maintained emotional boundaries. It was easier to keep him categorized as the man who had abandoned me when I wasn't confronted with evidence of his humanity, his own suffering. Thank you, I replied, defaulting to politeness in the absence of clear emotional guidance. Is everything all right? You look like hell? He attempted a self-deprecating laugh that didn't quite materialize. The lupus is challenging, but that's not why I needed to see you. He glanced around the restaurant, clearly uncomfortable with the public setting. Is there any chance we could talk privately? It's important. Valerie's expression hardened, her protective instincts in full force. Whatever you need to say can wait until after our celebration dinner, she stated firmly. Or better yet, can go through the proper channels you both agreed to. Ethan's grip tightened on his cane, knuckles whitening with either pain or frustration. This isn't about the divorce. It's a medical matter. Time-sensitive. A medical matter. The phrase hung between us, laden with implications. Whatever brought him here apparently couldn't wait for legal intermediaries, couldn't be communicated through proper channels. Give us 15 minutes, I said finally, making the decision, even as the words left my mouth. We'll finish our appetizers, and then I can step outside briefly. Relief washed across his features, followed quickly by apology. Thank you. I'll wait in the lobby. Take your time. After he walked away, moving with the deliberate care of someone managing chronic pain, Valerie leveled me with a concerned gaze. You don't owe him 15 seconds, let alone 15 minutes. I know. I pushed the remaining food around my plate, appetite diminished by the unexpected encounter. But whatever brought him here in person instead of going through Diane must be significant. Or a manipulation? Valerie countered, ever the skeptic where Ethan was concerned. He sees you celebrating good health news and suddenly has an urgent medical matter to discuss? The timing feels calculated. Her concern wasn't unfounded. The coincidence did seem suspiciously convenient. Yet something in Ethan's demeanor, the absence of his usual confidence, the physical evidence of his struggle, suggested this wasn't merely tactical. 15 minutes, I repeated, as much to reassure myself as Valerie. In public view from the lobby windows. If it veers into emotional territory, I'll end it immediately. True to my word, after finishing our appetizers and arranging for our entrees to be delayed, I made my way to the lobby where Ethan waited on a bench near the door. He stood when he saw me, the movement careful and measured. Thank you for this, he began, gesturing toward a small seating area away from the host station. I wouldn't have interrupted if it weren't important. We sat facing each other, the polite distance of acquaintances rather than the intimate proximity of former spouses. In the lobby's bright lighting, the changes in his appearance were more pronounced. Weight loss that bordered on gauntness, dark circles beneath eyes that held a weariness I recognized from my own mirror during treatment. What's going on, Ethan? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, neither warm nor cold. What couldn't wait for normal channels? He drew a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult admission. My condition has progressed more rapidly than initially anticipated. The medications they tried first haven't been effective, and the inflammation is affecting my kidneys. Medical information. Safe territory, facts rather than feelings. I nodded, encouraging him to continue while maintaining emotional distance. They want to try a more aggressive treatment protocol, but it requires... He paused, seeming to search for words that continued to elude him. Requires what? I prompted after the silence stretched uncomfortably. Your signature, he finally said, the words emerging with visible effort. As my spouse. The phrase landed like a stone between us, heavy with irony and unintended consequence. For months, I had been defined as Ethan's wife in medical settings, my treatment decisions requiring no external validation. Yet here he sat, requiring my authorization for his own care, despite having walked away when my need was greatest. The divorce isn't final for another 2 weeks, I noted, piecing together the situation. Legally, I'm still your next of kin. He nodded, relief evident that I understood without requiring further explanation. The treatment protocol involves a clinical trial component. They need consent from next of kin due to potential cognitive side effects during initial administration. And there's no one else who can sign? Your brother? Your parents? The questions weren't meant to be cruel, merely practical. Parents are in Arizona for the winter. Brother isn't technically immediate. Family for medical purposes. He met my gaze directly for the first time. The trial starts Monday. Waiting for the divorce to finalize means missing this treatment cycle. The next one isn't for 3 months. 3 months, a significant delay when battling aggressive disease. I knew this reality intimately, had lived the anxiety of waiting, while illness progressed unchecked. What exactly would my signature authorize? Clinical detachment seemed the only safe approach, emotions too complicated to navigate in this brief encounter. Experimental medication, acknowledgement of risks, permission for them to proceed if I'm temporarily unable to consent to continued treatment. He reached into his jacket, producing a folded set of papers. All the details are here. You can take them, review them, consult with whoever you need to. I accepted the documents without immediately opening them, their weight in my hands, symbolic of a responsibility I hadn't anticipated bearing. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on me, the abandoned spouse now holding medical authority over the person who had walked away. I'll review these tonight, I said finally, tucking the papers into my purse. I can let you know my decision tomorrow. Thank you. The gratitude in his voice seemed to encompass more than this immediate response. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, not after what I did. This acknowledgement, spoken plainly, without qualification or excuse, created a small crack in the wall I'd built between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first step toward something less bitter than the anger I'd carried for months. No, you don't have that right, I agreed, rising from my seat to signal the end of our 15 minutes. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't sign. I'll call you tomorrow. As I turned to rejoin Valerie in the restaurant, Ethan spoke once more, his voice barely audible. The scans. I really am glad they were clear. You deserve that good news, Maddie. I paused without turning, acknowledging his words with a slight nod, before continuing toward the dining room, where celebration and normalcy waited to reclaim the evening. Behind me sat a man facing his own mortality, seeking help from the person he had wounded most deeply. Ahead lay friends, food, and the simple joy of good health news. The decision between them seemed complicated in theory, but clarified with each step I took back toward the life I had built without him. I could sign his forms without forfeiting my boundaries. I could offer medical consent without offering emotional absolution. Most importantly, I could make this choice from a position of strength rather than obligation, the final authority resting with me, not him. What I couldn't anticipate, as I slid back into my seat across from Valerie's questioning gaze, was how this single decision would unravel a truth about Ethan's abandonment that would force me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the day he walked away. You're not seriously considering signing, are you? Valerie's question cut through my thoughts as our entrees arrived, her concern evident in the furrow between her brows. The celebration dinner had shifted tone, our earlier lightheartedness, now overshadowed by Ethan's unexpected appearance. I don't know, I admitted, arranging my napkin with unnecessary precision. I need to review the documents first. After everything he did, walking out when you were at your most vulnerable, you don't owe him this. Valerie's protective instincts were in full force, her loyalty unwavering. It's not about owing, I replied, surprising myself with the clarity that emerged as I spoke. If I refused to sign, it wouldn't be justice. It would be vengeance. And I don't want to be that person, Val. I don't want cancer and abandonment to turn me into someone who denies medical treatment to another. Human being, even him. Valerie's expression softened. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between the 4th chemo session and learning to grocery shop with 0 white blood cells, I offered with a small smile. Trauma's expensive education, but apparently it sticks. We managed to salvage some of our celebratory mood. Though Ethan's papers sat like a weight in my purse, their presence a tangible reminder of decisions waiting to be made. Later that night, after Valerie had gone home with promises to support whatever choice I made, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. The medical terminology was familiar, not the specific condition, but the language of experimental. Protocols, informed consent, and risk acknowledgement. I'd signed similar forms for my own treatment, the desperate mathematics of potentially fatal side effects balanced against the certainty of unchecked disease progression. The clinical trial involved immunosuppressive therapy combined with targeted treatments specific to lupus nephritis. As Ethan's legal next of kin, I would be authorizing treatment that carried significant risks, including increased infection vulnerability and temporary cognitive impairment during initial administration. Most critically, I would be empowered to make continuing treatment decisions if he became temporarily unable to consent. It was an intimacy I hadn't anticipated revisiting. This access to his medical vulnerability, this authority over his care. For a year, I had worked to disentangle our lives, to reclaim independence from a partnership that had failed when tested. Now, with my signature, I would momentarily step back into the role of his wife in the most consequential way possible. Morning arrived with clarity. I texted Ethan before I could second-guess myself. I'll sign the forms. Where and when? His response came almost immediately. Thank you, Maddie. More than I can express. Doctor's office at University Hospital, 2 p.m. today? I can meet you in the lobby. It felt strange preparing to see Ethan by appointment, selecting clothes with the conscious awareness that he would see me in them. I chose a simple outfit, jeans, boots, and a deep blue sweater that Dorothy had once commented brought out the color in my eyes. Not dressing up exactly, but not hiding in the oversized clothes that had become my uniform during treatment either. My reflection showed a woman reclaiming herself, still thinner than before, hair still regrowingly in soft waves rather than my previous shoulder-length style, but recognizably, undeniably me again. The hospital lobby held too many memories. I'd walked through these same automatic doors dozens of times for my own treatment, sometimes leaning on Valerie's arm, sometimes gathering my strength to enter alone. Now I arrived as neither patient nor caregiver, but as something more complicated, the estranged wife whose legal status still carried medical authority. Ethan waited near the information desk, his posture betraying fatigue he might have hidden in our previous life together. He straightened when he saw me, a reflexive gesture that couldn't quite mask his physical discomfort. Thank you for coming, he said, the formality between us a stark contrast to our 12 years of casual intimacy. Dr. Sharma's office is on the 4th floor. We rode the elevator in silence, the small space amplifying the awkwardness between us. Standing beside the man I had once known better than anyone, I realized how completely he had become a stranger. His medical condition, his daily struggles, his life in Chicago, all unknown territories to me now. Dr. Sharma's office reflected its occupant's personality, precisely organized yet surprisingly warm, medical credentials sharing wall space with vibrant artwork from various cultural traditions. The doctor himself, a man in his early 50s with kind eyes behind stylish glasses, greeted us with a professional warmth that acknowledged the complexity of our situation without directly addressing it. "Mrs. Cooper, thank you for coming. I understand this is an unusual circumstance." His slight accent curved around the words pleasantly. "It's Ms. Cooper now. Or it will be officially in 2 weeks," I corrected gently. "But yes, I'm here to review the trial documentation." "Of course." He gestured toward the chairs facing his desk. "Please, both of you sit. I want to ensure you have complete information before signing." What followed was a thorough explanation of Ethan's condition, the aggressive autoimmune response, the kidney involvement that elevated his case from concerning to urgent, the failure of standard treatments to achieve adequate control. Dr. Sharma explained the experimental protocol with practiced clarity, neither minimizing risks nor overemphasizing worst-case scenarios. "The initial treatment phase carries the highest risk of adverse reaction," he explained, sliding a diagram across his desk that outlined the protocol timeline. "This is why we require next-of-kin authorization. During the first 48 hours, some patients experience temporary cognitive effects that can impact decision-making capacity." I studied the diagram, asking clarifying questions about specific medications and monitoring procedures. Throughout this exchange, Ethan remained unusually quiet, watching the interaction with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "And the success rate?" I finally asked, looking up from the papers. Dr. Sharma's expression turned measured. "For cases with kidney involvement similar to Mr. Cooper's, we've seen disease stabilization in approximately 68% of participants, with significant improvement in 40%. Not overwhelming odds, but better than the alternatives apparently." I nodded, absorbing this information alongside the detailed risk profile. "I'd like a moment alone with Ethan," I said, the appropriate designation still elusive, despite our current circumstances. "Before signing." "Of course." Dr. Sharma stood, collecting several papers from his desk. "I'll step out to review Mr. Cooper's latest lab results. Take your time." When the door closed behind him, silence expanded between us like a physical presence. Through the office window, afternoon sunlight illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, the same sunlight that had streamed through our bedroom window. The morning after Ethan had packed his bags and walked away. "Why did you really leave?" The question emerged unbidden, surprising us both with its directness. "Not the version you gave me that night, about not being strong enough. The actual reason." Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. The wedding band was gone. Removed months ago, I assumed, though I'd never noticed its absence during our limited interactions. "Does it matter now?" he asked quietly. "I'm about to sign papers giving me authority over your medical treatment if you become incapacitated," I replied evenly. "So, yes, I think complete honesty matters very much right now." He remained silent for so long I thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held a resignation I hadn't heard before. "I was scared," he began, echoing his original explanation. "But not just of watching you suffer. I was scared because 3 weeks before your diagnosis, I'd started experiencing the first symptoms of whatever this is." He gestured vaguely toward himself. "Joint pain, extreme fatigue, weird rashes that came and went. I'd already had 2 doctor's appointments trying to figure it out." The revelation landed like a physical blow, rearranging pieces of a puzzle I thought I'd completed months ago. Memories shuffled and realigned. His increasing withdrawal before my diagnosis, the distraction I'd attributed to work stress, the way he'd flinched when I touched him some mornings. "You were sick when I was diagnosed," I said slowly, processing this new information. "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't have answers yet," he continued, still not meeting my eyes. "Just symptoms and doctor's concerns and blood tests with abnormal results they couldn't quite interpret. Then your diagnosis came, And suddenly what? I prompted when he trailed off. Suddenly there wasn't room for both of us to be sick. The words emerged with difficulty, as if extracted rather than offered. You had cancer, Maddie. Stage 3 breast cancer. My unexplained joint pain and fatigue seemed trivial by comparison. So you decided to just leave, rather than tell me you were also facing health problems? The logic remained elusive, the missing piece still hidden. Ethan finally looked up, his expression a complex mixture of shame and something else. Fear, perhaps, or long-held tension finally releasing. I left because I knew I couldn't be what you needed, he said, each word measured carefully. Not just emotionally, but physically. The symptoms were getting worse. Some days I could barely get out of bed myself, let alone take care of someone else. I couldn't drive you to chemo appointments when I was experiencing vision changes that made driving dangerous. I couldn't be your caregiver when I was barely managing my own increasingly debilitating symptoms. And you didn't think I deserved to know that? You just decided for both of us? I thought I was sparing you, he replied, his voice cracking slightly. You needed to focus entirely on fighting cancer, not worrying about my mysterious health problems. I thought it was the right thing, to remove myself as a burden rather than add to what you were already carrying. The stunning selfishness of his unilateral decision collided with the recognition of his misguided intention. He had made a choice that belonged to both of us, had denied me agency in our marriage's most critical test, all while believing himself noble for bearing his struggle alone. That wasn't your decision to make, I said finally, the anger in my voice tempered by a new, complicated understanding. We were married, Ethan. Partners. You didn't get to decide what I could or couldn't handle. I know that now. His admission carried the weight of months of reflection. It was the worst mistake of my life, Maddie. Not just leaving, but leaving the way I did. Making you believe it was because I couldn't handle your illness, when the truth was, I couldn't handle both of ours simultaneously. Through the window, clouds passed over the sun, momentarily dimming the office. In that brief shadow, I saw our parallel journeys with new clarity, both of us fighting invisible battles within our bodies, both struggling with fear and uncertainty, but doing so on divergent paths because of one monumentally misguided decision. When were you diagnosed with lupus? I asked, returning to the medical facts as safer territory. 3 months after I left. By then, the symptoms had become impossible to ignore. The joint pain, the extreme fatigue, the kidney issues. He gestured toward the trial documents on Dr. Sharma's desk. I've been through 3 treatment protocols since then. This trial is essentially my best remaining option. The chronology created a starkly different narrative than the one I'd constructed in my mind. While I'd imagined Ethan building a new life in Chicago, free from the burden of a sick wife, he had instead been navigating his own medical labyrinth, alone by his own misguided choice. This revelation didn't erase his abandonment. The hurt remained real, the trust broken. But the black and white portrayal of his actions now contained uncomfortable shades of gray, a wrong decision made from a complex mixture of fear, misplaced protection, and his own unaddressed health crisis. I reached for the consent forms that had brought us to this moment of unexpected truth. The signature line waited for my authorization, a simple act with complex implications. I need you to promise me something, I said, uncapping the pen Dr. Sharma had left on his desk. Not for the past, but for right now. Ethan nodded, waiting. Complete honesty from this point forward. No more unilateral decisions about what I can or can't handle. No more protective deceptions. If I'm signing these forms, I need to know I'll get the unvarnished truth about your condition and treatment, not some curated version you think I should hear. I promise, he replied without hesitation. Complete transparency. I signed my name on each indicated line, the familiar motion carrying the weight of authority I never expected to exercise again. With each signature, I authorized treatment that might save him, acknowledged risks that might cause harm, accepted responsibility that legally remained mine until our divorce was finalized. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly as I signed the final page. The simple phrase seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what had just transpired between us. Not just the medical authorization, but the revelation that had reframed our shared history. Dr. Sharma returned, reviewing the completed documentation with professional efficiency. "Everything appears in order," he confirmed, adding the forms to Ethan's medical file. "We'll begin treatment Monday morning at 8. Mr. Cooper will need to be admitted Sunday evening for preliminary testing and medication." As we prepared to leave the office, the doctor addressed me directly once more. Ms. Cooper, we'll need a reliable contact number where you can be reached during the initial treatment phase. The first 48 hours are critical, and as the authorized decision-maker, you may be contacted if complications arise." The request underscored the continuing connection between us, not just legal paperwork, but potentially life-altering, decisions still binding us together despite all that had happened. Outside the hospital, standing beside my car in the waning afternoon light, I faced Ethan with new understanding that had not yet translated to forgiveness. "I'll keep my phone on," I said, the practical consideration easier to address than the emotional revelation still settling between us. "Maddie," he began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to our complicated situation. "I don't expect this changes anything about the divorce or us. I just wanted you to know the truth. Finally." I nodded, unable to offer more. In that moment, the truth had indeed changed something, not erasing the pain of abandonment, but complicating the narrative I'd constructed to explain it. The man before me was neither villain nor victim, but something more human than either caricature, someone who had made a catastrophically wrong choice from a place of fear and misguided protection. "Good luck with the treatment," I said finally, opening my car door. "I hope it works, Ethan." As I drove away, watching his diminished figure in my rearview mirror, I realized that the signature he had needed was only the beginning. What waited ahead, for both of us, would require more than legal authorization. It would demand a reckoning with truth, pain, and the possibility of a different kind of healing than either of us had anticipated. Little did I know that Monday's treatment would set in motion events that would force us both to confront not just what had been lost, but what might still remain beneath the rubble of our broken marriage. Sunday evening arrived with an unexpected text from Ethan. "Admitted to hospital. Room 417. Treatment begins 8 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you again for making this possible." The message sat on my phone screen like a visitor neither wholly welcome nor entirely unwanted. Its presence required acknowledgement but not necessarily response. After several minutes of consideration, I replied with neutral practicality. "Got it. Wishing you strength for tomorrow." That night, sleep proved elusive. My mind continually circled back to Ethan's revelation in Dr. Sharma's office, the secret struggle he'd hidden even before my diagnosis, the misguided attempt at protection that had resulted in abandonment. These new pieces of information refused to settle neatly into the narrative I'd constructed over the past year, instead creating a dissonance that demanded resolution I wasn't yet prepared to offer. I called Valerie just after midnight, knowing she often stayed up late grading library research papers. "Do you think it's possible to do the wrong thing for partially right reasons?" I asked when she answered, skipping the social niceties our friendship had long since moved beyond. "Ah," she replied, the single syllable acknowledging she understood exactly what, or rather who, had prompted this late-night philosophical question. "You're thinking about what he told you." I had shared Ethan's revelation with her immediately after leaving the hospital, needing her perspective to help process this unexpected complication. I keep trying to fit this new information into what happened, and it changes things without changing them, if that makes any sense. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from passing cars move across its surface. What he did was still abandonment, but knowing he was struggling with his own health issues makes it less calculated. Less of a villain, more of a deeply flawed human making terrible decisions under pressure, Valerie suggested, her initial rigid judgment softening somewhat. Exactly. And that's harder to metabolize than the clean, clear betrayal I've been carrying. Because pure villains are easier to get over than complicated humans who hurt us while hurting themselves, she observed with characteristic insight. So where does that leave me? Especially now that I'm legally responsible for medical decisions if he becomes incapacitated? The question that had been keeping me awake finally emerged. Valerie's sigh carried through the phone. It leaves you exactly where you've been all along, Maddie, making the best decisions you can with the information available, one day at a time. Her practical wisdom provided enough comfort to eventually find sleep, though my dreams were populated, with hospital corridors and unsigned forms that kept multiplying whenever I tried to complete them. Monday morning began with steady rain that seemed appropriate to my unsettled mood. Though I had no obligation to physically attend Ethan's treatment, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. Each glance at the clock calculated what might be happening in room 417, preliminary blood work at 7:00, final consent reviews at 7:30, the experimental treatment beginning promptly at 8:00. By 10:30, restlessness drove me to the high school where I'd arranged to meet with Dorothy about potentially returning to teaching part-time for the spring semester. The familiar hallways provided welcome distraction, students offering cheerful greetings, as I made my way to the English department office. "You look better every time I see you," Dorothy observed as I settled into the visitor chair across from her desk. "The hair is coming in beautifully." I self-consciously touched the soft waves that had finally grown long enough to style into something intentional rather than merely post-chemo. "Thanks. It's different than before. Curlier somehow." "Chemo curls," she nodded knowingly. "My sister-in-law had the same thing after her treatment. Straight hair her whole life, then suddenly curls. Bodies are mysterious that way." We spent the next hour discussing practical aspects of my potential return, modified teaching schedule, shared responsibilities with the long-term substitute who had managed my classes during my absence, accommodations I might need during continued recovery. The normalcy of professional conversation anchored me, providing a counterweight to the emotional turbulence of recent days. "We'd love to have you back whenever you're ready," Dorothy concluded, handing me a tentative schedule proposal. "Even if it's just 2 classes to start. The students ask about you constantly." The warmth of belonging somewhere, of being missed and valued, provided unexpected emotional ballast. I miss them too. And teaching. I think starting with 2 classes would be perfect. As I left the building, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The hospital prefix sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system before I answered. "Ms. Cooper?" A professional female voice inquired. "This is Nurse Ramirez from University Hospital. I'm calling regarding Ethan Cooper." My free hand gripped the railing of the school's front steps. "Yes, I'm his emergency contact. Is everything all right?" "Mr. Cooper is experiencing some complications from the initial treatment administration. Nothing immediately life-threatening," she added quickly, "but he's developed a significant adverse reaction that Dr. Sharma would like to discuss with you. As the person authorized to make medical decisions if necessary, your presence would be appreciated." The carefully neutral medical terminology barely masked the underlying message. Something had gone wrong, and decisions might need to be made. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I replied, already changing direction toward the parking lot. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of windshield wipers and worry, though I had signed the consent forms with full knowledge of potential complications. The abstract possibility had now transformed into concrete reality. Whatever was happening in room 417 was serious enough to warrant my physical presence. The hospital's familiar layout guided me automatically to the fourth floor, where I found Nurse Ramirez waiting near the elevators. Her expression was professionally composed but carried the subtle tension of ongoing medical concerns. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading me down the corridor. "Dr. Sharma is with Mr. Cooper now. The reaction began approximately 40 minutes ago." "What kind of reaction?" I asked, matching her brisk pace. "Severe inflammatory response affecting multiple systems. Fever, blood pressure fluctuations, altered mental status." Her clinical assessment continued as we approached room 417. The experimental protocol anticipated possibility of such reactions, which is why the consent forms included specific contingency permissions. Outside Ethan's room, she paused. "I should prepare you. He's currently not fully lucid and has been placed on additional monitoring equipment since treatment began. Dr. Sharma can explain the medical details more completely." Nothing could have adequately prepared me for the sight that greeted me inside. Ethan lay amid a tangle of monitoring wires and IV tubes, his complexion alarmingly ashen except for feverish spots of color high on his cheekbones. The confident, capable man who had once run our household finances with spreadsheet precision now appeared terrifyingly vulnerable, his body seemingly at war with the very treatment meant to help him. Dr. Sharma stood at the bedside, examining readouts from one of the many machines connected to his patient. He turned as I entered, his expression grave but composed. "Ms. Cooper, thank you for coming. As you can see, Mr. Cooper is experiencing one of the more severe reactions documented in the clinical trial." I moved closer to the bed, instinctively, reaching for Ethan's hand before catching myself, uncertain whether touch was medically advisable or emotionally appropriate given our complicated status. "What happens now?" "That's precisely why I asked for you to come," Dr. Sharma replied, gesturing toward the room's small sitting area. "We have a decision point that requires your input as his authorized representative. Over the next 15 minutes, the doctor outlined the situation with methodical clarity. The experimental treatment had triggered a systemic inflammatory response more severe than typically observed in trial participants. Current interventions were maintaining stability, but decisions needed to be made regarding continuing or modifying the protocol. "We have 3 viable options," Dr. Sharma explained, presenting each with clinical detachment. "First, we can discontinue the experimental treatment entirely, transitioning back to conventional therapies despite their previous limited effectiveness. Second, we can temporarily pause treatment, administer additional anti-inflammatory medications, then resume at a reduced dosage. Third, we can continue the current protocol with intensive monitoring, operating under the theory that this initial severe reaction may actually indicate the treatment is engaging with the disease process, albeit more aggressively than anticipated. Each option carried distinct risks and potential benefits, none with guaranteed outcomes. As Dr. Sharma detailed the medical considerations of each approach, I found myself in the surreal position of weighing decisions about Ethan's treatment that he himself was currently unable to make, exactly the scenario outlined in the consent forms I had signed. "What would you recommend?" I finally asked, seeking the doctor's professional opinion as anchor for this impossible choice. Dr. Sharma considered the question carefully. Based on the aggressiveness of Mr. Cooper's lupus progression and the limited success of previous treatments, I would lean toward the second option, temporary pause followed by modified continuation. Complete discontinuation seems premature, given the potential benefits, while continuing at current levels poses unnecessary immediate risk. From the bed, Ethan stirred restlessly, murmuring words too indistinct to understand. The sight of him, fevered, confused, physically diminished, collided with memories of my own treatment journey, creating an empathy that transcended the complicated history between us. "I agree with your assessment," I said after careful consideration. Pause, stabilize, then continue at modified levels. Dr. Sharma nodded, making notes in Ethan's chart. We'll begin adjustment immediately. The next 24 hours will be critical in determining whether this approach proves effective. As the doctor issued orders to the nursing staff, I found myself drawn back to Ethan's bedside. His eyes flickered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever. For a moment, he seemed to register my presence. "Maddie?" His voice emerged rough and uncertain. "You came." "I'm here," I confirmed, finally allowing myself to take his hand. The simple human connection felt both foreign and familiar, like revisiting a country once known intimately, but long since departed. "They're adjusting your treatment to manage the reaction. You need to rest." His fingers tightened weakly around mine. "Stay? Please?" The request, vulnerable, direct, without qualification, bypassed the complex emotional calculations I'd been making since learning the truth of his departure. In this moment, he wasn't my soon-to-be ex-husband who had abandoned me during cancer treatment, nor the man whose hidden health struggles had complicated my understanding of that abandonment. He was simply a frightened human being facing his own mortality, seeking comfort in a world suddenly reduced to hospital machinery and medical uncertainty. "I'll stay for a while," I promised, pulling the room's single chair closer to his bedside. His eyes closed, relief visible even through the fever's distortion of his features. Within minutes, he had drifted back into uneasy sleep, though his hand remained loosely clasped in mine. As afternoon faded into evening, I maintained my vigil, watching the medical team adjust medications and monitoring equipment. Nurses came and went, taking vitals and making notations, their experienced efficiency, a reassuring counterpoint to the gravity of the situation. Through it all, I found myself in the strange position of advocate and observer, authorized to make medical decisions for a man whose life had become separate from mine, yet still connected by legal documentation and shared history too complex to easily categorize. During a brief period when Ethan's room was momentarily empty of medical personnel, his eyes opened again, clearer than before, suggesting the adjusted medications were beginning to take effect. "You're still here," he observed, voice stronger though still shadowed with exhaustion. "I said I would stay." The simple truth required no elaboration. "The treatment. Something went wrong?" His question revealed awareness returning. "Not wrong exactly. Stronger reaction than expected. They've adjusted the approach, paused the primary medication temporarily while they get the inflammation under control. We'll try again at a lower dosage once you're stabilized." The clinical "we" slipped out unconsciously, a linguistic remnant of our years together facing problems as a unit rather than individuals. If Ethan noticed, he gave no indication. "You made that decision?" he asked, eyes focusing more intently on my face. "In consultation with Dr. Sharma. It seemed the most balanced approach, not abandoning the treatment entirely, but modifying to reduce immediate risk." He nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. "It's what I would have chosen. Thank you." The simple acknowledgement carried weight beyond the immediate medical situation, reaching toward our shared past and the decisions made there, some together, some unilaterally, all contributing to our current complicated reality. As night settled over the hospital, transforming windows into dark mirrors reflecting the room's interior, Dr. Sharma returned for a final evening assessment. Ethan's condition had stabilized sufficiently to reduce immediate concern, though continued monitoring remained essential. "You should get some rest," the doctor advised me. "We have your contact information if anything changes overnight. Tomorrow, we'll likely bring additional decisions regarding treatment continuation." Though logical, the suggestion to leave encountered unexpected resistance within me. The strange intimacy of the day, making medical decisions for Ethan, witnessing his vulnerability, rediscovering the simple human connection of hand-holding during crisis, had created an emotional territory I wasn't yet prepared to navigate. "I'll come back in the morning," I finally agreed, gathering my purse and jacket. "Around 8? Dr. Sharma nodded approval. "Perfect timing. We'll have overnight data to review by then." As I prepared to leave, Ethan's voice stopped me at the doorway. "Maddie?" The single word held a question he seemed unable to fully articulate. I turned back, finding his gaze steadier now, fever receding under the influence of adjusted medications. "Yes?" "Why did you stay all day? After everything? You could have just made the decision by phone." The question deserved honest response, though I wasn't entirely certain of the answer myself. Because decisions about someone's medical care shouldn't be made at a distance when you have the option of being present. Because I know what it's like to wake up confused in a hospital room. Because I paused, searching for the underlying truth. Because despite everything, I wouldn't want anyone to face this alone. His eyes held mine for a long moment, understanding passing between us that required no further words. With a slight nod that acknowledged both my answer and the complex history it contained, he closed his eyes, allowing medicine and exhaustion to pull him back toward healing sleep. As I drove home through nighttime streets, the day's events replayed, in continuous loop. The medical emergency had temporarily suspended the emotional calculations that had dominated our interactions since his revelation about his own health struggles preceding my cancer diagnosis. In crisis, we had reverted to more fundamental human connections, care, concern, presence, without resolving the deeper questions his admission had raised. Tomorrow would bring new medical data, new treatment decisions, and inevitably, return to the complicated reality of our nearly finalized divorce and the painful history between us. But for today, something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps its prerequisite. The recognition of shared humanity, despite profound hurt. What I couldn't yet see was how this medical crisis would ultimately force both of us to confront not just the past we couldn't change, but the future we hadn't yet dared to imagine. Morning brought temporary reprieve from the emotional complexity of the previous day, a few hours of normalcy before returning to the hospital and all it represented. I followed my recovery routine with deliberate focus. Gentle yoga, protein-rich, breakfast, medication with precise timing. The familiar rhythm provided grounding when so much else felt uncertain. As promised, I arrived at University Hospital shortly before 8, armed with coffee and the emotional fortification of a night's distance from yesterday's crisis. The hospital corridors felt different in morning light, less ominous, more matter-of-fact. Medical staff changed shifts with practiced efficiency, the night team transferring knowledge to day colleagues in the condensed language of healthcare professionals. Outside room 417, I paused, preparing myself for whatever condition awaited inside. Yesterday's medical emergency had created an unexpected intimacy between Ethan and me, a temporary suspension of the careful distance we'd maintained since his departure. Today would require renegotiating those boundaries in the context of his continuing treatment and my legal responsibility for medical decisions. What I found inside surprised me. Ethan sat propped against pillows, significantly more alert than when I'd left him. Though still connected to various monitoring equipment, the feverish disorientation had subsided, replaced by apparent lucidity. He was scrolling through his phone with his free hand, looking remarkably like a businessman catching up on emails, rather than a patient who had experienced a severe treatment reaction just hours earlier. He glanced up at my entrance, surprise, registering briefly before his expression settled into something more guarded. "You came back." I said I would. I set one of the coffee cups on his bedside table. "Black with 1 sugar, if your preferences haven't changed. Though I should probably have checked if you're allowed caffeine. Dr. Sharma actually recommended it this morning. Something about counteracting some medication side effects. He reached for the cup with cautious movements that betrayed residual discomfort. "Thank you." The small courtesy between us, coffee, remembered exactly as he preferred, created momentary normalcy in our profoundly abnormal situation. We sipped in silence for several minutes, the beeping monitors providing background rhythm to our unspoken thoughts. "You look better," I finally observed, settling into the chair I'd occupied for hours the previous day. "More present. I feel more human today. Yesterday is mostly a blur, but I remember you were here." His gaze held mine with newfound directness. "You stayed most of the day." Decisions needed to be made. I kept my response neutral, not yet ready to examine the complex emotions that had kept me at his bedside beyond practical necessity. "Maddie," he began, but was interrupted by Dr. Sharma's arrival. The doctor carried Ethan's chart and a cautiously optimistic expression. "Good morning to you both. Mr. Cooper, your overnight numbers show significant improvement. The modified approach appears to be achieving stabilization without completely abandoning the treatment protocol." What followed was a detailed medical assessment, complete with recommendations for continuing treatment at reduced dosage once Ethan's system had fully stabilized. The doctor presented the information with professional clarity while remaining sensitive to the complexities of our situation, addressing both of us equally, acknowledging my decision-making authority while respecting Ethan's improved capacity for self-determination. "I believe we can proceed with the modified protocol tomorrow, assuming today's stability continues," Dr. Sharma concluded. "With your dual agreement, of course." That subtle acknowledgement that decisions would, ideally, be made collaboratively despite the legal authority vested solely in me, provided framework for the medical path forward. We both agreed to the proposed approach, signing updated consent forms that reflected the modified treatment plan. After the doctor departed, silence returned. Heavier now, laden with conversations postponed by medical necessities. Ethan broke, it first, his voice stronger than it had been since his appearance at the restaurant days earlier. "Thank you for making the right call yesterday. Continuing treatment was important to me, even with the risks. I tried to make the decision you would have made for yourself," I replied, surprised by how naturally this consideration had factored into my thinking despite our estrangement. "You did." His confirmation carried weight beyond the immediate medical situation. "Better than I did for you when our positions were reversed." The reference to his departure during my cancer treatment hung between us. The elephant in the room we had circled, but not directly addressed since his revelation about his own concurrent health struggles. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question emerged finally, direct and unavoidable. "When you started experiencing symptoms, before my diagnosis. We were married, Ethan. Partners. Why keep that from me?" He set his coffee aside, attention fully focused on this conversation we could no longer postpone. "At first, because I thought it was just stress, or maybe early arthritis. Nothing serious enough to worry you about. Then, after several doctor visits with inconclusive results because I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of it being something serious, of saying it aloud and making it real." His admission came with difficulty, each word precisely chosen. I've always been the practical one, the planner, the person who handles problems. Admitting I was facing a health issue I couldn't control or immediately solve felt like failure. The insight into his thinking created unexpected resonance with my own early reaction to cancer diagnosis. That initial resistance to acknowledging mortality, the impulse to maintain control by restricting information flow. "So you just carried it alone?" "Until I couldn't anymore. By the time your diagnosis came, I was already struggling with increasingly debilitating symptoms with no clear cause. The idea of both of us being sick simultaneously." He trailed off, searching for words. "It seemed impossible. One of us needed to be the caregiver, the strong one. And I was already knowing I couldn't be that person, though I didn't have a diagnosis to explain why yet. So you left. The condensed version of his explanation still carried the sting of abandonment, though now contextualized by understanding I hadn't possessed before. I made the worst possible choice, he acknowledged, meeting my gaze directly. Convincing. Myself, it was better for you to have a clean break than a half-present husband who could barely take care of himself, let alone provide the support you deserved during cancer treatment. A nurse entered to check vitals, temporarily pausing our conversation. In that brief reprieve, I considered the narrative Ethan had constructed, his misguided conclusion that complete abandonment would somehow serve me better than honest struggle together. The profound wrongness of his decision remained, but the context shifted it from pure selfishness to catastrophic misjudgment born partially of his own undiagnosed medical condition. After the nurse departed, Ethan continued with renewed determination. I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did, Maddie. Nothing excuses walking out when you needed support most. I'm telling you because you deserved the truth then, and you deserve it now. When were you diagnosed with lupus? I asked, seeking the timeline that would help me understand the full picture. 3 months after leaving. By then, my symptoms had become impossible to ignore or attribute to stress. The joint pain, fatigue, and cognitive issues were affecting my ability to function at work. The Chicago position became impossible to maintain. He gestured to the hospital room. I've been back in town for treatment for about 2 months now, staying with my brother while trying different medication protocols. The pieces aligned with the fragments I'd gathered from mutual acquaintances, his return coinciding with my last phases of cancer treatment, his presence in town while I was focused on my own recovery. 2 parallel medical journeys unfolding in the same small city, connected by legal documents but separated by choices that couldn't be unmade. Why didn't you tell me after you were diagnosed, when you had answers? This question felt equally important. Why the continued secrecy even after his condition had a name and treatment plan? Ethan's expression reflected genuine regret mixed with lingering uncertainty. By then, the divorce was proceeding. You were still in treatment. Adding, my diagnosis to everything you were carrying seemed selfish, and I'd already hurt you so deeply by leaving. I thought knowing I was also ill might feel like, I don't know, like I was trying to manipulate your sympathy or justify my actions. The irony struck me forcefully, how his attempts to avoid burdening me had ultimately created greater harm, how decisions made unilaterally for my own good had denied me agency in our shared life. The pattern revealed itself clearly, his protective impulse twisted into its opposite through secrecy and assumption. You don't get to decide what information I can handle, I said finally, the core issue clarifying. That was always the problem, Ethan. Not that you were sick. Not even that you left, though that was devastating. But that you made these enormous, life-altering decisions based on what you thought was best for me, without ever giving me a voice in them. He absorbed this assessment without defense, nodding slowly. You're right. I've had a lot of time to think about it during my own treatment. The fundamental disrespect in believing I knew better than you what you could handle. The arrogance in that assumption. His acknowledgement, full, without qualification or excuse, created unexpected space between us, room for something beyond the hurt and betrayal that had defined our relationship for the past year. A light knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Dr. Sharma returned, accompanied by another physician I didn't recognize, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and the focused expression of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. Mr. Cooper, Ms. Cooper, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eleanor Wells, our nephrology specialist, Dr. Sharma said, his formal tone suggesting this wasn't a routine consultation. She's been reviewing your case and has some additional information to share regarding your kidney function. Dr. Wells stepped forward, her manner direct but compassionate. Mr. Cooper, our latest tests show more extensive kidney involvement than initially detected. The lupus nephritis has progressed significantly, despite our current interventions. The gravity in her voice sent a chill through the room, the temperature seemingly dropping with each carefully measured word. What does that mean for the treatment plan? Ethan asked, his businessman's instinct for cutting to core issues evident even in medical crisis. It means we need to consider more aggressive intervention, she replied, opening his chart to reference specific data. Your kidney function indicators have declined to concerning levels. If this progression continues at current rates, we may be looking at potential organ failure within months rather than years. The stark assessment hung in the air between us, mortality suddenly present as a tangible third party in the room. I found myself reaching for Ethan's hand without conscious decision, the instinctive human response to crisis temporarily suspending the complicated history between us. What options do we have? The we emerged naturally, acknowledging our shared stake in this conversation despite our nearly finalized divorce. Dr. Wells outlined several potential approaches, each carrying significant risks balanced against the certainty of continued decline without intervention. The conversation moved into increasingly specialized medical territory: immunosuppression protocols, dialysis contingencies, and finally, the option neither of us had anticipated. Given your age, overall health aside from the lupus, and the aggressive nature of your kidney involvement, you should be evaluated for transplant candidacy, Dr. Wells concluded. A living donor would be ideal, as the waiting list for cadaver kidneys involves precious time you may not have if the disease progression maintains its current course. The word transplant landed like a physical object between us, heavy with implication. What had begun as consent for an experimental treatment protocol had suddenly expanded into life-altering medical territory. Organs, donors, years of immunosuppression, and the shadow of mortality no longer abstract but immediate. I'll need time to process this, Ethan said finally, his voice steady despite the enormity of the information just presented, and to understand all the options more thoroughly. Dr. Wells nodded understanding. Of course, we'll schedule a dedicated consultation to discuss the transplant evaluation process in detail. In the meantime, we'll continue with the modified treatment protocol Dr. Sharma has implemented. The experimental treatment may still help slow the progression, buying time for more definitive intervention. After both doctors departed, silence reclaimed the room. Our hands remained connected, neither of us acknowledging this unexpected physical link, nor withdrawing from it. The medical crisis had temporarily suspended the emotional boundaries so carefully constructed during our separation, creating an intimacy of shared crisis that transcended our complicated history. That was not what I expected from today's doctor visit, Ethan finally said, attempt at humor falling flat against the gravity of the situation. No, I agreed, still processing the implications. Quite the plot twist. His fingers tightened, slightly around mine. Maddie, I don't expect you to be involved in any of this. The transplant discussion, the ongoing treatment decisions, that goes well beyond signing consent forms for an experimental protocol. Our divorce will be finalized. Before any of those processes would begin, you've done more than enough already. His words carried genuine release from obligation, an acknowledgement that the boundaries of our legal separation superseded any expectation of continued support through his medical journey. Yet something in his phrasing, the careful distancing, the formal absolution, struck a discordant note against the reality of our current connection. Let's not make decisions about anything today, I replied, surprising myself with the open-endedness of this response. One day at a time, remember? That got me through cancer treatment. It might serve us both now. The us slipped out unintentionally, creating momentary confusion in Ethan's expression before he nodded acceptance. One day at a time. As I finally withdrew my hand, preparing to leave him to rest before tomorrow's treatment resumption, I realized how profoundly the landscape had shifted in just 24 hours. What began as reluctant legal obligation to sign medical consent forms had expanded into territory neither of us had anticipated: kidney failure, transplant evaluation, and questions about continued connection that extended far beyond our impending divorce finalization. What awaited us now wasn't just medical decisions or legal dissolution, but fundamental questions about forgiveness, obligation, and whether shared crisis might forge connections that mere legal documentation could neither create nor sever. As I gathered my belongings to leave, glancing back at Ethan's thoughtful expression, I understood that tomorrow would bring not just modified treatment protocols, but conversations neither of us had been prepared to have about past wounds, present realities, and possible futures we had not dared consider. The kidney transplant bombshell detonated quietly throughout the rest of my day, aftershocks reverberating at unexpected moments. While browsing produce at the grocery store, the phrase organ failure suddenly surfaced, causing me to set down a tomato with trembling fingers. During a phone call with Dorothy about my teaching schedule, transplant candidacy whispered beneath our practical discussion of classroom assignments. Even during evening yoga, living donor intruded into meditation, disrupting hard-won serenity. By nightfall, I could no longer outrun the questions that had pursued me since leaving the hospital. I called Valerie, needing her grounding perspective. "I'm bringing wine," she declared after I summarized the day's dramatic developments. "Don't argue. This situation requires Cabernet at minimum." She arrived 30 minutes later with not just wine but dinner, containers of homemade soup and fresh bread, the comfort food and unspoken acknowledgement of emotional turbulence. "So kidney failure," she said without preamble as she poured generous glasses of red. That escalated quickly from experimental treatment to potential transplant. Dr. Wells made it sound like they've been monitoring the kidney involvement all along, but it suddenly accelerated. I accepted the wine gratefully, though technically I shouldn't have been drinking it so soon after cancer treatment. Tonight seemed to warrant exception. The timeline she outlined was sobering. "Months rather than years," Valerie echoed my earlier description. "That's genuinely terrifying, regardless of your complicated history." We settled into the living room sofa, familiar territory for conversations that had charted my journey through diagnosis, treatment, abandonment, and recovery. This latest development seemed almost fictional in its dramatic timing. Ethan's kidney failure revealed just days before our divorce finalization, his health crisis intersecting with my recovery in ways neither of us could have anticipated. "I don't know what to do with any of this," I admitted, staring into my wine glass as if it might contain answers. 2 weeks ago, I was focused on finally closing the legal chapter of our marriage. Now I'm authorized to make his medical decisions, witnessing specialist consultations about organ failure and— I stopped abruptly, the thought too nascent to voice. "And what?" Valerie prompted, her insight as sharp as ever. "And wondering if I should get tested as a potential donor." I finished in a rush, the words materializing fully formed despite not having consciously considered this possibility until this moment. Valerie's expression shifted through several emotions before settling into careful neutrality. "That's a significant thought to be having about the man who walked out during your cancer treatment." "I know how it sounds," I acknowledged, the idea simultaneously absurd and impossible to dismiss. "But it keeps circling back. The fact that I'm likely a compatible blood type, that I've already been through extensive medical screening during my cancer treatment, that I know firsthand what it means to face mortality alone." "But you weren't alone," Valerie interjected. "You had me, Dorothy, your medical team, your support group. You built a community around your recovery precisely because Ethan wasn't there." Her reminder carried weight, the truth of resilience forged through abandonment, strength discovered in his absence rather than his presence. "You're right," I conceded. "And yet—" The unfinished thought hung between us. "And yet you're still considering it," she completed, resignation tempering her concern. "After everything." "Not deciding," I clarified. "Just not immediately dismissing it either. There's so much to consider. My own health status post-cancer, the risks involved, what it would mean for boundaries I've worked so hard to establish." Valerie set down her wine, leaning forward with uncharacteristic intensity. "Maddie, listen to me. You're just months out of cancer treatment. Your body is still healing. The idea of volunteering for major surgery to give an organ to the man who abandoned you when you needed him most. I need to make sure you're thinking clearly and not getting swept up in medical crisis mode." Her concern was valid, her protection fierce and loving. Yet something in her characterization didn't quite align with my evolving understanding of the situation. "That's just it," I said slowly, thoughts clarifying as I spoke them aloud. "I'm not sure the man who abandoned me is the complete story anymore. Learning about his own health struggles doesn't erase what happened, but it does complicate the narrative. He made a catastrophically wrong choice, but not from the place of pure selfishness I've assumed for the past year. So what? His kidney failure is some kind of cosmic justice? Now you're supposed to sacrifice part of your recently recovered body to save him?" Valerie's protective instincts emerged as skepticism, her loyalty firmly aligned with my well-being. "No, nothing that simplistic." I shook my head, searching for words to explain the nuanced shift occurring within me. "It's more about recognizing that suffering isn't a competition. His wrong choices don't negate his humanity or his current medical crisis. And my capacity for compassion wasn't actually destroyed by his abandonment, though I sometimes thought it might be." Valerie studied me intently, her initial resistance softening slightly. "When did you get so wise?" "Cancer's expensive education," I replied with a half smile. "You either learn profound lessons or waste a lot of suffering." We finished our wine in contemplative silence, the soup cooling forgotten on the coffee table. Finally, Valerie spoke again, her tone gentler but still concerned. "Just promise me you won't make any organ donation decisions before the divorce is finalized. Give yourself that legal closure before considering something so permanent." It was a reasonable boundary, a protection against emotional decisions during continued upheaval. "I promise. The transplant evaluation process would take time anyway. I'm just acknowledging the possibility exists rather than immediately rejecting it." Later that night, after Valerie had gone home with promises to check in tomorrow, I found myself drawn to the small wooden box on my dresser where I kept significant mementos. Among them was the card Ethan had written for our 10th anniversary, just 18 months before my cancer diagnosis changed everything. "Maddie," it read in his distinctive handwriting, "a decade feels both monumental and brief, like we've lived lifetimes together while simultaneously just beginning. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for your strength when I falter, your optimism when I doubt, your humor when I take myself too seriously. Here's to decades more of becoming better together than we could ever be apart. All my love, Ethan." The words carried painful irony now. The future we'd planned unraveled by illness and fear, his gratitude for my strength followed by abandonment, when that strength was most tested. Yet something in the sentiment still rang true, a reminder of the connection that had existed before cancer and lupus rewrote our story. I returned the card to its box, neither discarding it as irrelevant nor elevating it to renewed significance. Like so much between Ethan and me now, it existed in an intermediate space, acknowledging what had been real without determining what might still remain. Morning brought fresh perspective and a decision to focus on immediate practicalities rather than hypothetical donor questions. I had promised to check on Ethan's modified treatment resumption, a commitment that existed independently of any larger considerations about our relationship or potential medical interventions. At the hospital, I found his room transformed by technology I hadn't seen the previous day. Additional monitoring equipment suggesting heightened medical concern despite yesterday's optimistic treatment modifications. Dr. Sharma met me in the B hallway before I entered, his expression grave. "Ms. Cooper, I wanted to speak with you first." Mr. Cooper experienced another significant reaction overnight. Different presentation than the first episode, this time affecting kidney function more directly. "Is he stable?" The question emerged automatically, priorities clarifying instantly. "Currently, yes. We've adjusted medications again and added temporary dialysis support to reduce strain on his kidneys." The doctor hesitated briefly. "Ms. Cooper, this development accelerates our time frame considerably. Dr. Wells is expediting the transplant evaluation process. While we'll continue the modified treatment protocol, its effectiveness now appears more limited than initially hoped." The medical reality solidified, no longer theoretical, months rather than years, but immediate intervention requirements. Specialized equipment already in place, discussions moving from possible to necessary transplantation. "May I see him?" I asked, medical details temporarily secondary to the human connection suddenly, urgently important. Dr. Sharma nodded, gesturing toward the door. "He's conscious and oriented. We've discussed the overnight developments, so he's aware of the situation." Inside the room, Ethan appeared surprisingly calm despite the additional equipment surrounding him. Our eyes met as I entered, his expression reflecting recognition of the gravity his doctors had conveyed. "Quite the night," he said, attempty. At lightness undermined by the visible strain in his features. "Sorry about the upgraded stage production." He gestured toward the dialysis machine now humming beside his bed. "I hear you're determined to experience every possible hospital department," I replied, matching his tone while settling into the now familiar visitor chair. Most people would just take the standard tour. The small exchange of normalized conversation created momentary respite from medical crisis, a reminder of the easy rapport we'd once shared before illness intervened, both his and mine. "They've accelerated the transplant evaluation," he said after a moment, abandoning pretense of casual conversation. "Dr. Wells already has nephrology surgeons consulting. Everything's moving much faster than they initially outlined." I nodded. The information already conveyed by Dr. Sharma requiring no clarification. "How are you feeling about that? Beyond the physical symptoms, I mean." Ethan considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness, even in crisis. "Overwhelmed. Grateful for medical intervention. Terrified of the unknowns. Mostly." He paused, seeming to debate whether to complete the thought. "Mostly? Wishing the timing had been different. That this had happened before I made the worst mistake of my life by leaving when you needed me. That we were facing this together from a foundation of trust rather than across a divide of broken promises." The raw honesty created space for reciprocal truth. "I've been thinking about that too. How different this would be if it had happened a year ago, before everything unraveled. If we had faced both diagnoses together rather than separately." "Do you think we could have?" he asked, the question layered with meaning beyond its surface. "Handled both serious illnesses simultaneously, I mean. In retrospect, was I right about at least that part? That it would have been too much for a marriage to bear?" The question struck at the heart of assumptions that had guided his catastrophic decision to leave. That our relationship couldn't withstand dual medical crises. That separation was inevitable given the circumstances. My answer mattered not. Just historically, but in framing whatever relationship might exist between us moving forward. "I think," I began carefully, certain only as the words formed, "that we'll never know what might have happened if you'd been honest from the beginning. But I believe relationships can withstand almost anything except secrets and unilateral decisions." It wasn't the dual illnesses that would have been unbearable, Ethan. It was the way fear of vulnerability became deception, and deception became abandonment. He absorbed this assessment with visible impact, recognition dawning that the foundation of his decision, protection through separation, had been fundamentally flawed. "The divorce hearing is in 3 days," he noted after a lengthy silence, the legal reality reasserting itself amid medical crisis. "Given everything happening medically, I've asked my attorney to file for postponement. Not to complicate things for you," he added quickly, "but because I literally can't attend while hospitalized, and the transplant evaluation process involves medical and insurance considerations that might be affected by our legal status." The practical implications hadn't occurred to me. How his accelerated medical crisis might intersect with our nearly complete legal separation. The divorce postponement created breathing room, time to navigate the complexity of his health crisis, without the immediate pressure of status change. "That makes sense," I acknowledged, the practical considerations easier to address than emotional ones. "My attorney mentioned the hospital had already contacted the court about your medical situation." Silence settled between us again, comfortable in its acknowledgement of circumstances too complex for immediate resolution. Outside his window, winter sunlight created patterns across the hospital grounds, everyday life continuing its rhythm despite the suspended reality inside these walls. "Maddie," Ethan began, hesitation evident in his voice, "I need to ask you something, but I'm not sure I have the right." "Ask," I replied simply. "I'll tell you if it crosses a line." He drew a deep breath, gathering courage. "If the transplant evaluation determines I need a living donor, would you consider being tested for compatibility?" "Not committing to anything," he clarified immediately. "Just the initial screening. I have no right to ask after everything, but my brother was already tested during earlier phases of treatment and isn't compatible. And time seems increasingly important given the accelerated progression." The question I had unconsciously anticipated since yesterday's kidney failure revelation now lay explicitly between us. No longer theoretical, but immediate. No longer avoidable, but requiring response. Whatever answer I gave would shape not just his medical options, but the nature of connection that might exist between us moving forward. "I've already been considering it," I admitted, the truth emerging more easily than expected. "Not deciding, just not automatically dismissing the possibility. There are many factors involved, including my own post-cancer health status and what such a choice would mean for both of us beyond the medical implications." Relief washed across his features, not at agreement, which I hadn't offered, but at the absence of immediate rejection. "That's more than I had any right to expect. Thank you for even considering it." The monitors continued their reassuring rhythm, marking stability amid life-altering discussions. Outside the room, hospital routine continued. Shift changes, medication rounds, the quiet efficiency of an institution dedicated to navigating human vulnerability. Inside, two people who had once promised lifetime partnership now contemplated whether that connection, though legally severed, might extend to the most literal form of life support, the sharing of vital organs. "One day at a time," I reminded. Us both, returning to the mantra that had sustained me through cancer treatment. Let's see what the transplant evaluation reveals before either of us makes decisions about next steps. As I prepared to leave, promising to return the following day, Ethan caught my hand briefly. "Whatever you decide about any of this, the testing, the postponed divorce, all of it, I want you to know something." His gaze held steady, conviction evident despite physical weakness. "I was wrong when I left. Not just morally wrong, but factually incorrect in my assessment of what was possible. We could have faced both illnesses together. I see that now, watching your strength during my crisis after you've just emerged from your own. I failed us both when I underestimated what we could handle together." The acknowledgement, so different from general apology or abstract regret, lodged deep within places I'd thought permanently closed to him, not erasing the hurt of abandonment, but offering something I hadn't realized I needed: validation that the partnership I'd believed in hadn't been illusory, that what we'd built together had deserved better than his fearful retreat. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, the simple words inadequate for their significance. "It matters, Ethan. Even now." Walking from the hospital into winter sunshine, I found myself at a crossroads both literal and figurative. The path leading away from Ethan and toward my independent future remained open, divorce postponement merely delaying rather than preventing legal closure. Yet another possibility had emerged alongside it. Not reconciliation exactly, but some new configuration of connection that acknowledged both past wounds and present crisis, both separate journeys and potential shared future. For the first time since his departure, I allowed myself to consider this alternative path, not from obligation or misplaced loyalty to broken vows, but from the genuine recognition that compassion wasn't a finite resource to be protected from those who had caused pain, but rather an expandable capacity that might include even those who had hurt us most deeply. What awaited at the end of either path remained unclear. But as I drove home through streets that had witnessed both my cancer battle and emerging recovery, I realized the decision itself constituted a form of healing. The ability to choose freely rather than react from wound or obligation representing growth beyond what either illness or abandonment had taken from me. The transplant evaluation proceeded with medical efficiency over the following weeks, a stark contrast to the emotional complexity surrounding it. Ethan's condition stabilized, temporarily with dialysis support, buying precious time for testing and assessment. The postponed divorce hearing remained in limbo, neither rescheduled nor withdrawn, existing in the same intermediate state as our relationship, neither fully connected nor completely severed. I returned to teaching part-time in February, 2 classes rather than my previous full schedule. Standing before students again provided grounding normalcy amid the swirling uncertainty of hospital visits and medical consultations. The classroom represented territory untouched by either cancer or marital dissolution, a space where I existed simply as Ms. Cooper, English teacher, rather than cancer survivor or estranged wife of a transplant candidate. "You seem more yourself," Dorothy commented after observing one of my senior literature discussions. "There's a spark that was missing even before your diagnosis." Her observation gave me pause. Had something fundamental shifted beyond physical recovery? The woman who stood confidently before students analyzing Toni Morrison's prose was indeed different from the one who had received a cancer diagnosis nearly 2 years earlier, changed not just by illness, but by the journey through abandonment, treatment, independence, and now this unexpected chapter with Ethan. "I feel more myself," I acknowledged, or perhaps more accurately, a new version of myself that incorporates everything that's happened. Dorothy nodded understanding. "The integration of experience rather than merely surviving it. That's real healing, Madeline." That evening, I received the call I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Dr. Wells herself, rather than hospital administrative staff, her direct contact signaling the significance of the information. "Ms. Cooper, we've completed Ethan's comprehensive transplant evaluation," she began, professional tone unable to completely mask the urgency beneath. "The results confirm our preliminary assessment. His kidney function continues to decline despite maximum medical intervention. Without transplantation within the next 2 to 3 months, his prognosis becomes extremely guarded." The clinical language conveyed stark reality. Ethan's condition was deteriorating faster than treatment could stabilize. The theoretical, months rather than years timeline had condensed to a specific, immediate window. "What are his options?" I asked, the question both personal and practical. "He's been placed on the national transplant list as highest priority, but waiting. Times even for urgent cases average 7 to 9 months in our region. Given his declining function, that timeline is problematic." Her careful phrasing conveyed the unspoken, The national list likely wouldn't deliver an organ in time. And living donation? The question emerged from a decision already forming, though not yet fully articulated even to myself. Remains his best option for immediate intervention and optimal outcome. His brother has been excluded as incompatible, as have 2 cousins who volunteered for testing. We've begun community outreach through the hospital's living donor program, but finding compatible strangers willing to donate is statistically challenging within our compressed time frame. The information created clarity rather than pressure, a complete picture of medical reality without direct appeal. Dr. Wells, despite knowing my relationship to Ethan, maintained professional boundaries by presenting facts without suggestion. "I'd like to be tested," I said finally, the decision crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. "For compatibility as a potential donor." Brief silence preceded her measured response. "Given your recent cancer treatment, we would need comprehensive evaluation of your current health status before determining candidacy. Are you certain you wish to pursue testing?" "Yes." The simplicity of my answer belied the complex journey toward it. Weeks of consideration, conversations with Valerie and my own doctors, quiet internal accounting of risks and motivations. "I understand the evaluation may determine I'm not a suitable candidate regardless of compatibility. I'm prepared for that possibility." "I appreciate your willingness to consider donation, Ms. Cooper, especially given the complicated circumstances." Her diplomatic phrasing acknowledged the unusual situation without presuming to understand its emotional dimensions. "I'll have my office contact you tomorrow to schedule initial testing." After ending the call, I stood at my living room window, watching evening descend over the neighborhood, the same window where I'd once observed Ethan's departure with suitcase in hand, the beginning of a chapter I'd never anticipated. Now I contemplated another unexpected beginning, one equally impossible to have predicted. The testing process unfolded with methodical thoroughness over the following week: blood work, tissue typing, comprehensive health assessment. My oncologist coordinated with the transplant team, providing detailed data from my cancer treatment and recovery to ensure donation wouldn't compromise my hard-won remission. I hadn't told Ethan about my decision to be tested. Something in me resisted creating expectation or hope before medical viability was confirmed. This boundary felt important, maintaining agency over my choice without external pressure, even the unspoken pressure of his knowledge. 10 days after my initial testing, Dr. Wells requested an in-person meeting. The formality suggested significant news, though her neutral tone revealed nothing about its nature. Her office reflected her personality, organized, understated, focused on function rather than appearance. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, expression carefully composed. "Thank you for coming in, Ms. Cooper. I wanted to discuss your test results personally rather than by phone." The pause that followed contained multitudes: medical assessment, ethical considerations, and recognition of the human complexity underlying clinical data. "You are a compatible match for Ethan," she stated simply. "In fact, you're an unusually strong match for non-related individuals, which significantly increases the likelihood of successful transplantation." The information landed with physical impact, possibility transforming to reality in 6 simple words. You are a compatible match for Ethan. "However," she continued, her tone shifting slightly, "your recent cancer history presents complicated considerations. While your current remission status is excellent and your recovery has been remarkable, donation surgery and subsequent single kidney status would introduce additional risks to your long-term health profile." She outlined these risks with careful precision: increased vigilance requirements, potential complications if cancer were to recur, lifestyle modifications necessary with single kidney status. Neither minimizing concerns nor overstating them, she presented comprehensive information for informed decision-making. Given these factors, the transplant committee would support your donation if that remains your choice, but with additional monitoring protocols and the clear understanding that your own health must remain paramount in any decisions moving forward. The balanced assessment, neither encouraging nor discouraging donation, respected my capacity to weigh complex factors independently. This medical acknowledgement of agency echoed what I'd needed most during my cancer journey and had been denied. During Ethan's abandonment, the right to make informed choices about my own body and life without others deciding what I could handle. I appreciate the comprehensive evaluation, I said finally, and the respect for my ability to make this decision with full information rather than protective filtering. Dr. Wells nodded, understanding extending beyond the immediate medical situation to the larger context of my history with Ethan. Will you want time to consider this information before discussing next steps? No, I replied with certainty that surprised even me. I've been considering all possibilities throughout the testing process. If I'm medically cleared to donate despite the additional risk factors, my decision remains the same. Then, with your permission, I'd like to inform Ethan of your compatibility and willingness to proceed, unless you prefer to discuss this with him yourself first. I considered the question carefully. This moment, the revelation of compatibility and my decision to donate, represented a significant juncture in our complicated journey. How it was conveyed mattered. I'd like to tell him myself, I decided, today, if possible. Dr. Wells arranged immediate hospital access, bypassing normal visiting restrictions given the circumstances. As I made my way to Ethan's room, I reflected on the circular nature of our story, how I had once faced cancer with his absence creating a void where support should have been, and how he now faced organ failure with my presence offering literal life support he had no right to expect. I found him dozing, the combined effects of medication and kidney dysfunction evident in his drawn features. Even in sleep, tension remained visible, the body's awareness of its own precarious state transcending consciousness. I settled quietly, in the visitor's chair, allowing him natural awakening rather than deliberate interruption. When his eyes finally opened, recognition and surprise registered sequentially. Maddie, I wasn't expecting you today. I had a meeting with Dr. Wells, I replied, the significance of this statement registering immediately in his expression. About the testing, he stated rather than asked, awareness dawning that this unscheduled visit following a meeting with his transplant specialist could have only one meaning. Yes. The simple confirmation hung between us, momentarily suspended before I continued. I'm a compatible match, Ethan. A strong one, according to Dr. Wells. His reaction came in waves, initial disbelief followed by cautious hope, then immediate concern. But your recovery, the cancer treatment, would donation be safe for you? The question reflected genuine consideration for my well-being, rather than mere recipient gratitude, evidence of perspective that had been absent in his earlier decision to leave rather than face dual illness together. There are additional risk factors because of my medical history, I acknowledged honestly. Increased monitoring requirements, lifestyle modifications, heightened vigilance if cancer were to recur. But the transplant committee has cleared me as a viable donor if I choose to proceed. If, he repeated, focusing on the conditional. Maddie, I never expected. After everything that happened between us, the fact that you even considered being tested is more than I deserved. But actually donating an organ, that's a permanent physical connection that goes beyond anything I have any right to ask. You didn't ask, I reminded him gently. I offered to be tested, and now I'm choosing to donate, with full understanding of both the medical and emotional implications. Silence expanded between us, filled with unspoken questions about motivations and meanings, about whether this biological connection represented something larger about our relationship or merely medical practicality. Why? He finally asked. the simple question containing complex layers. After I left when you needed me most, why would you literally give a piece of yourself to keep me alive? The question deserved honest answer, not simplified notions of forgiveness or obligation. But the complex truth I had only recently fully understood myself. Not out of some misplaced sense of duty to wedding vows you broke, I began, certainty growing with each word. Not to earn moral superiority or to create indebtedness. Not even from simple human compassion, though that's part of it. I paused, finding precise language for the understanding that had emerged during weeks of testing and consideration. I'm doing this because cancer taught me that suffering isn't a competition, because your wrong choice doesn't negate your humanity or current need, because I refuse to let your worst decision determine the person I choose to be. My voice strengthened with conviction born of hard-won clarity. Mostly, I'm doing this because I can. Because having faced my own mortality, I understand the preciousness of life in ways theoretical compassion never reaches. Your kidney failure and my cancer exist in the same universe of human vulnerability, different manifestations of the same fundamental fragility we all share. Tears formed in his eyes, not manipulative emotion seeking sympathy, but genuine recognition of the profound grace being extended without requirement of deservedness. I don't know how to accept something this significant, he admitted, vulnerability, plain in his expression. The same way I accepted help during cancer treatment after you left, with humility, without expectation that it erases complicated history, and with commitment to honor the gift by living meaningfully. The parallel wasn't accusatory but instructive, drawing connection between our separate journeys through medical crisis. The divorce, he began hesitantly. What does this mean for... One decision at a time, I interrupted gently. Right. Now, we focus on the transplant. Legal questions can wait until we're both physically recovered. He nodded acceptance of these priorities, medical urgency temporarily superseding legal closure. Thank you seems catastrophically inadequate. It is, I agreed without rancor. So perhaps instead of thanking me, commit to living a life worthy of second chances, both medical and otherwise. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later, sufficient time for final medical preparations while respecting the urgency of Ethan's declining function. During this interim, I completed necessary arrangements, medical leave from my newly resumed teaching position, practical household preparations for recovery, legal documentation regarding post-surgical care, and potential complications. The morning of surgery arrived with surprising calmness. Whatever fear or hesitation might have been expected was absent, replaced by quiet certainty about the choice I had made. As the transplant team completed final preparations, Ethan was wheeled briefly into my pre-op area, an accommodation to our unique circumstances as donor and recipient with complex shared history. I meant to ask, he said, unexpected lightness in his tone despite the gravity of our situation. Does this mean I'll develop a sudden interest in Toni Morrison and feminist poetry? The joke, so characteristic of our earlier relationship, before illness intervened, created momentary normalcy amid extraordinary circumstances. Cellular memory is a powerful thing, I replied with matching humor. Don't be surprised if you wake up craving chocolate and wanting to analyze symbolism in everyday objects. Behind the banter lay deeper recognition that regardless of our legal status or future relationship configuration, this surgery would connect us biologically in ways that transcended ordinary boundaries. Part of me would literally live within him, sustaining life function that his body could no longer maintain independently. As they prepared to wheel me toward the operating room, Ethan caught my hand briefly. Maddie. My name contained universes of meaning in his voice. Whatever happens between us going forward, whether we finalize the divorce or find some new way to exist in each other's lives, I want you to know that I see who you are. The strength it takes to offer life to someone who caused pain. The grace in choosing compassion when resentment would be justified. I see you. The acknowledgement, so different from his earlier abandonment when fear had prevented him from truly seeing my capacity to handle difficulty, created closure to one chapter even as we began another. To be seen fully, capacity for both vulnerability and strength, recognized without filtering or protection. This was what had been missing during his departure, and what now allowed genuine connection despite our complicated history. I see you, too, I replied simply. Both who you were when fear dictated choice, and who you're becoming through your own medical journey. The operating room lights seemed appropriately symbolic, brightness illuminating vulnerability, technology facilitating. The most human of exchanges. As anesthesia began its work, my last conscious thought was not of fear or regret, but of the circular journey that had brought us to this moment, from abandonment to life-giving connection, from severed relationship to shared humanity. 6. Months later, I stood on the shore of Lake Morrison, autumn painting the surrounding trees in brilliant transformation. Beside me, Ethan looked healthier than he had in years, kidney function fully restored through the successful transplant. We had developed a new relationship in the months following surgery, neither the marriage we had once shared nor the complete estrangement of abandonment, but something more nuanced that acknowledged both past wounds and present connection. The divorce had been finalized 3 months after successful recovery, a mutual recognition that our marriage in its original form had ended when he walked away during my cancer treatment. Yet something else had grown in its place, a friendship, rooted in shared vulnerability, mutual respect, and the literal biological connection of a donated organ. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, skipping a stone across the lake's surface. The donation, I mean. I considered the question with the same thoughtfulness I now applied to all aspects of our complex relationship. No. It was the right choice, not despite our history, but partially because of it. The most powerful response to abandonment wasn't clinging to hurt, but demonstrating capacity for compassion that transcended it. He nodded, understanding extending beyond words. We had developed a new language in recent months, one that acknowledged past failures without allowing them to dictate future possibilities, that recognized connection without demanding traditional relationship structures. "The latest blood work looks excellent," he offered. "Medical updates now part of our regular communication. Dr. Wells says kidney function remains optimal." Good. My simple response contained genuine satisfaction. The physical piece of me, functioning within him, represented neither obligation nor regret, but a choice made from strength rather than weakness, agency rather than victimhood. As sunset approached, painting the lake in colors no artist could fully capture, I reflected on the circular journey of the past 2 years, from cancer diagnosis through abandonment, from medical crisis to life-giving connection. The signature Ethan had once needed for insurance forms had expanded into authorization for experimental treatment, then into surgical consent for organ transplantation. Each signature representing not just legal permission, but evolving capacity to offer compassion, without forfeiting boundaries. "Time to head back," I noted as darkness began its approach. We walked toward separate cars, literal representation of our current relationship status, connected but independent, sharing significant life events while maintaining distinct daily existences. "Dinner next week?" he confirmed, our monthly kashay ritual of checking in now comfortable rather than obligatory. "I'm bringing the restaurant gift card Dorothy in the English department gave me for my transplantiversary." Perfect. The simple exchange reflected our new normal. Connection without the weight of failed expectations. Communication without the shadow of abandonment. Driving home through familiar streets, I passed the hospital where both our medical journeys had unfolded, my cancer treatment and his kidney failure creating unexpected symmetry. The building stood as monument to human vulnerability and resilience, to medical science and human compassion, to endings that contained beginnings within them. The woman who navigated home through twilight streets was neither the abandoned wife nor the wronged victim I had once identified as, roles that had temporarily defined but ultimately failed to contain the person I had become through this journey. Instead, I moved through the world as simply myself, shaped by illness without being defined by it, touched by abandonment without being diminished by it, connected to Ethan through biology and shared history without being bound by failed expectations. The signature he had once needed, first for insurance forms, then for experimental treatment, finally for life-saving transplantation, had evolved from obligation to choice, from legal requirement to profound human connection. In offering life to the man who had once walked away, I had paradoxically found my own life expanded rather than diminished, my capacity for compassion deepened rather than depleted. As I arrived home, to the house that had witnessed both abandonment and healing, I recognized that the most significant signature of all had been the one I had metaphorically placed on my own life: the authorization to move beyond victimhood into agency, beyond hurt into wisdom, beyond abandonment into the complex, nuanced territory of genuine human connection. Not despite the wounds that had shaped me, but because of them, transformed through the circular journey that had brought me finally and completely home to myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.